Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1201. The pupils of Botis's eyes had already turned deep black, and they were frozen in a look of indescribable fear. It made Klein's heart palpitate when he saw it, as though he could feel the intense changes in Botis's emotions before his death. After a series of inspections, together with divination, he confirmed that these two eyeballs didn't contain any Beyonder characteristics, but they contained a strong corruptive force and a power that came from an unknown source. It could be used as a medium for curses, and it could directly affect the target. It was a rather dangerous spiritual material with an extremely long expiry date. I can't bring it with me for extended periods of time. Otherwise, I might be weakened mentally, have nightmares every day, and suffer a physical mutation. Klein casually summoned a square metal box and placed Botis's two eyeballs into it. He didn't attempt to purify it, because once the item was shattered and purified, there would be nothing left. It would be too wasteful. Due to the fact that there was nothing wrong with the Worms of Star and that it was also a material that Klein understood the most, he quickly turned his attention to the black pocket. The results of divination surprised him because it was a so-called interspatial object. The pocket only had the size of an adult man's palm. But in actual fact, it had the size of the two-bedroom apartment that the Moretti family had rented in Tingen in the very beginning. It was big enough to hold many things. Check out latest novels on novel-bin.com. This was made by Botis using the powers of a secret sorcerer. In essence, the pocket wasn't an object but an entrance. First, a region in the spirit world is distorted and isolated using space concealment, then, use the chaos created when the spirit world overlaps with reality. As long as there are proper coordinates, one can directly reach their destination, opening the door to that hidden area and entering this pocket space. This is very similar to the method needed for sealing the box of the Great Old Ones. However, one door is in the spirit world, while the other is in the real world. This results in a sealed artifact or mystical item inside the interspatial pocket to also affect the wielder. From the looks of it, it doesn't seem to be of much use, as it can't eliminate the negative effects. Besides, I'm in the forsaken land of the gods and can't connect to the spirit world. There's no use to having such a pocket. Also, I have to reinforce the power of space concealment from time to time. Otherwise, it will gradually lose its effectiveness. It's only suitable for demigods of the apprentice pathway, or an organization that has demigods of the apprentice pathway or sealed artifacts that provide the relevant support. The name interspatial pocket is too lame. I wonder how Botis named this item. Let's call it Traveler's Bag. After confirming the degree of danger, Klein conjured a fake hand and placed it into the black pocket. Pitter-patter. A bunch of gems poured out as the fake hand was retracted and landed on the long, mottled table. The crystal-clear red, blue, green, white, black, and translucent colors instantly filled his eyes. I should have predicted this. The corresponding materials of the apprentice pathway are gems, all the gems. The expression on Klein's face turned spirited as he sighed with a smile. He reached out with his other hand and picked up a few gems to feel the weight and texture. Apart from these, there were also quite a number of spiritual materials in the traveler's bag. Some were commonly used, while others were relatively rare. The box of the Great Old Ones, the secret sorcerer's Beyonder characteristic, 9 Worms of Star, Botis's eyeballs, traveler's bag, and large amounts of gems and materials. This operation can be considered quite a harvest, enough for everyone to split it fairly. Unfortunately, Botis had the ability to record Beyonder powers and certain states. There's no need for him to bring too many sealed artifacts and mystical items with him. That would result in many negative effects. As a demigod, he should have a few good sealed artifacts. I wonder if they're hidden somewhere in the spirit world or at the Aurora Order headquarters. It's a pity that Botis's soul had just collapsed as well, preventing me from using spirit channeling on it. Klein shook his head and immediately returned to the real world. He found a hidden spot, put down the lantern, and set up a bestowment ritual. He wanted to see if he could bring 0-61 the box of the Great Old Honesto, the forsaken land of the gods. If he could attempt transforming the entire city of silver into toys and placing them on the first level of the sealed artifact. he could directly send it to the outside world through the sacrificial and bestowment rituals. This way, he could bypass the giant king's court and dark angel Sasria, and could ingeniously complete the miracle invoker ritual. After performing a series of tasks, Klein was done with his preparations as he reached out his right hand. He pulled out another himself before his actual body leaped into the fog of history and hid in the void of a time before the first epoch. He was worried that the box of the Great Old Ones would cause a random death the moment it passed through the sacrificial and bestowment door. In the fragments of light deep in the greyish-white fog, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and returned above the grey fog, responding to his own prayers. After the mysterious ancient door of sacrifice and bestowment took form, he slowly opened it. He waved his hand, summoning the box of the Great Old Ones that was enveloped by layers of forces, throwing it into the gap behind the illusory door, towards the boundless darkness behind the door. At that moment, the void's darkness suddenly became corporeal, as though it formed an invisible barrier that blocked the door that had just opened. It floated in midair, unable to move forward. Klein frowned slightly as he watched this scene. He tried to stir the powers of Sapphira Castle and use the power at the level of an angel to push it forward, but he was unable to get the box of the Great Old Ones to break the barrier. Indeed, the forsaken land of the gods is sealed. It's just that I'm closely related to Sapphira Castle, so I could use it to respond. However, this cannot exceed a certain limit. Klein nodded slightly. He retrieved the box of the Great Old Ones and threw it onto the junk pile. Then, he conjured the world German Sparrow and got the fake person to give the detailed information of the box of the Great Old Ones to Hermit and Miss Justice. This was to remind them to bring the box of the Great Old Ones back to the real world within 24 hours, and to release the magician force. While doing so, Klein had informed Miss Justice to sacrifice some top-grade ice cream to the Snake of Fates blessed before praying for the bestowment of the box of the Great Old Ones. As for the hermit Catlear, she didn't need to make any external requests due to her having brief luck. However, she needed to complete everything within a few minutes and sacrifice the box of the Great Old Ones above the grey fog once more. Backland, in the border between East Borough and the Bridge area, in an apartment that had been in disrepair for years. Leonard, who was wearing red gloves and a black coat, was leading his team members to check the scene. As the reserve force of the Church of Evernight, they were undoubtedly filled with energy at nearly 10 at night. "Captain, there's a serious crack on the walls here. Some of the walls have even been shattered. This apartment might not hold after the hurricane season next summer." The wine-red-haired Cindy came over and reported to Leonard. Leonard scanned his surroundings with his green eyes and nodded slightly. "Thankfully, this place is dangerous to begin with, and it has been abandoned for a long period of time. However, it's very strange that even tramps don't live here." Cindy thought for a moment and said, "Captain, do you mean that there are beyond us using this apartment, so they're secretly chasing away the tramps who sleep here?" Another red glove, Bob, happened to be checking the bottom of the wall and casually added, "And then, they had an internal strife that developed into a battle. Something was then ignited?" "That possibility can't be ruled out," Leonard answered in a professional manner. "But have you noticed? Every place in this room has signs of corrosion, and there's a lack of the remnants left behind by tables and chairs that should exist. It looks too empty. This doesn't look like something a low or mid-sequence Beyonder can create. I suspect that it might involve a higher level of power." After a series of inspections and discovering many abnormalities, the Red Gloves team under Leonard failed to find any further clues. They could only return to St. Samuel Cathedral first. Just as they arrived underground, a bishop came to look for Leonard, asking him to bring 2 members upstairs for a meeting. Leonard nodded thoughtfully. Without asking anything, he led Bob and Cindy through a secret passage into St. Samuel Cathedral. Following that, they followed the spiral staircase and under the illumination of the crimson moonlight, they arrived in a room with many people. It was equipped with a blackboard. With just one glance, Leonard realized that there were quite a number of people who had worked with him before. They were from the Mandated Punishers, the Machinery Hivemind, and MI9. Then, he noticed the 3 demigods, Horamic Haydn, Randall Valentinus, and Anthony Stevenson, as well as a black-haired, golden-eyed man who was clearly at the same level as them. Without waiting for Leonard's greeting, St. Anthony stood up in his red-patterned black robe and said in a deep voice, "There was a high-level battle in the outskirts of Backland. There was a terrifying contamination present, as well as a tarot card the Hermit. I noticed that you've done some investigations regarding the large number of incidents involving tarot cards. You had also raised a corresponding theory. Now, please give everyone here a detailed introduction." The Hermit card? Leonard expressed his true astonishment, but this was mostly because he was tasked with such a mission. A whom? He cleared his throat, walked to the blackboard, and turned to face the demigods and beyonders of the three churches and the military. He drew a crimson moon on his chest. After organizing his words, this red glove captain said solemnly, "In the past 2 to 3 years, the incident involving tarot cards that really caught our attention was because of Lenivus's death. He was embroiled in a conspiracy that attempted to allow the true creator's descent, and his body was covered with tarot cards. After that, the tarot cards appeared on the Capim case again. However, this time, there was a change in the arrangement of the tarot cards. It emphasized Judgment and the Emperor. Back then, I linked these matters to an organization that suddenly believed in the Fool in Backland. As you know, the Fool is the starting card of the tarot cards. This bold guess made several demigods and many other beyonders nod slightly. They felt that this might indeed be related to some level of mysticism. Leonard paused before continuing, and below the Fool, this organization might have quite a number of official members. They use tarot cards as code names, such as Judgment, the Emperor, or the Hermit of this incident. As he spoke, Leonard picked up a deck of cards that he used as a demonstration and randomly picked one. He glanced at it and chuckled. Such as the Star. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1202. The demigods and beyonders present nodded at Leonard's demonstration, indicating that they understood what the red glove captain meant. One of the mandated punishers raised his arm and took the opportunity to ask a question. In other words, whoever left a tarot card behind is the member executing the mission. That should be the case. Leonard did not give a definite answer. The same mandated punisher continued asking, "What do the tarot cards that were scattered all over Lenivus's corpse mean then?" "There's no specific direction." Leonard immediately picked up a white chalk and wrote the name Lenivus on the blackboard behind him. Then, he drew a circle. "I've just said that in the past 2 to 3 years, the matter involving tarot cards have really caught our attention because of the Lenivus case. This is very likely the beginning of everything. Therefore, without a specific direction, the casually scattered tarot cards might be referring to the whole. This means that the organization that uses the tarot cards as code names has officially stepped onto the stage of history." Please forgive me for using poetic words. That makes a lot of sense. The few mandated punishers were convinced by Leonard. Leonard looked around and continued, "Let me use the Aurora Order, which everyone is familiar with, as a comparison. We all know that there are 22 oracles in the Aurora Order. Each of them will be in charge of a region's affairs. It's very possible that the organization with the tarot card code names is the same. The members of the likes of Judgment, the Emperor, and the Hermit should have their own factions. They will exert their influence in a particular region." Upon hearing this, a member of the machinery hive mind pondered and said, "However, the 3 members corresponding to Judgment, the Emperor, and the Hermit have appeared consecutively in Backland. According to what you just said, does this mean that the organization that uses tarot cards as code names are still lacking in scale, and that the members are all gathered in Lun, or perhaps just in the Backland region? After all, Backland's person in charge for the Aurora Order is only an oracle. As for St. Tenebrous, he's in charge of the entire Lun." Leonard slowly nodded, indicating that he understood what he meant. He organized his words and said, "This possibility cannot be ruled out. After all, this is an organization that has only appeared in the past 2 to 3 years. Of course, there might be other reasons. This organization might not be divided based on location demarcation. Instead, they are determined by whether or not they can handle an area alone. They will also work together depending on overlapping situations, such as the Capim case. Seeing that the Beyonders of the three churches and MI9 didn't raise any further questions, Leonard deliberated for a few seconds before saying, "Next up will be all my personal guesses. There are also some problems with it. This might be a direction of investigation for the future. The first question, what is the purpose of this organization? If they are like the Aurora Order, with the goal to spread the faith of an evil god, then why haven't we discovered people who believe in the Fall? Even if there are, they're all people who are scamming others in the name of the Fall. Second question, what do they have in common in the few operations? I haven't been able to find it yet. The third question I have is that high-level members who use tarot cards as their code names are not of low sequences and have their own factions. However, they aren't famous in the Beyonder world at all. This is very abnormal. After all, although the 22 oracles of the Aurora Order hide their identities, they have more or less crossed paths with us. They rose up from low-sequence Beyonders to middle-sequence Beyonders under our watch, eventually taking over the spot as Oracle when their predecessor dies or advances. They are all already on our lists. Having said that, Leonard paused and said, if the organization that uses the tarot cards as its code name is really an organization that believes in the Fall, then there is someone who can answer my third question. He's the crazy adventurer, German Sparrow. Rumor has it that he believes in the Fall. This name made all the Beyonders from the three churches and MI9 fall into silence, as though they were quickly recalling the relevant information. They had long heard that German Sparrow had a mysterious background. He believed in the Fall, and they had obtained quite a bit of information from him. However, they hadn't made any connections like Leonard to string everything together. A few seconds later, the Archbishop of the Church of Evernight, St. Anthony, said in a deep voice, a German Sparrow seems to be in close contact with the original Death Consul of Balaam. That's an angel who's still active over the land. This gave the Beyonders who weren't demigods a fright as they instinctively sat up straight. They all knew about Admiral Hell, but due to the confidential restrictions, they didn't know that the Death Consul represented a grounded angel. That Death Consul doesn't seem to belong to any faction of the numinous episcopate, said a Beyonder from MI9 hesitantly. Leonard nodded solemnly. Perhaps he is a member of the secret organization that uses the tarot cards as a code name. Any/W novel chapters are published on no/vel/bin.co/m. Death card. There was another round of silence. All the demigods had to admit that this was possible. The level of the secret organization that was represented by tarot cards suddenly rose, reaching a level that was equal to the Aurora Order. In short, German Sparrow is a clue. Leonard took a deep breath and slowly said, "Your Graces, ladies and gentlemen, I'm done." St. Anthony nodded slightly and stood up. He looked around and said, "Up to now, this secret organization that uses tarot cards as their code names hasn't targeted us yet. It has shown a certain level of friendliness. Now that the war situation is tense, we are severely lacking in manpower, so it's difficult for us to take any major actions. Therefore, I suggest that we try our best to avoid conflict with them and not attempt to eradicate them for the time being. Of course, we have to do what we need to do. A secret organization with the existence of a grounded angel itself represents danger. If we don't understand it or grasp enough information about it, we won't be able to react in time and stop any possible conspiracies." Horamic and the other demigods thought for a moment before nodding in agreement. Anthony Stevens looked around, his gaze landing on Leonard's face. "This investigation will be led by you. Coordinate it well." Leonard agreed solemnly. At this moment, Deep Blue Efficient Randall Valentina spoke to Leonard impatiently. "Give them a name. We can't keep saying secret organization that uses tarot cards as a code name. It's quite a mouthful. What suggestions do you have?" Leonard considered carefully before saying, "Tarot Club? That works." Randall stood up and said with a thunderous voice, "Let's call it the Tarot Club." Late at night, in Empress Borough, in the Hall family's villa. The exclusive dessert chef, Tim, suddenly woke up from his dream and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. He had just dreamed that he was enjoying an ice cream and had just eaten it when he woke up. The more he thought about it, the more intense his cravings became. In the end, he overcame his feelings that it was trouble and got out of bed. Putting on a thick sleeping robe, he walked out of the room and came to a pantry not far away. As a slightly famous dessert chef in the aristocratic circles, Tim was given special privileges by Earl Hall. He could enter the pantry at any time and use the ingredients here to test his new ideas. Meanwhile, Tim had repeatedly returned Earl Hall's trust with high-quality desserts. Of course, he often appeared in the pantry due to midnight cravings for food, just like now. After some serious and hard work, Tim used the remains and prepared ingredients to make a few cups of ice cream and ate half of it. Then, he patted his stomach, washed the cutlery, and left the pantry in satisfaction. The remaining few cups of ice cream were left in the corner, as if they had been completely forgotten. In Sherwood Borough, by the Tussock River, in an uninhabited shallow flat. Wearing a dark-colored cloak, Audrey first made use of dream traversal to arrive nearby before walking over on foot. She skillfully set up the ritual and prayed to Mr. Fall. Soon, a silver-black accessory box embedded with many gems tore through the illusory door and landed in front of Audrey. Audrey tucked a wisp of blonde hair behind her ear and picked up the box of the Great Old Ones, 0 to 61, without any delay. She aimed at a few rocks and pulled open the first layer. Silently, numerous long tables and chairs appeared messily in the area. Several beyonders that had used various means to conceal their faces appeared. One of them was the hooded Force. Their skin quickly changed from that of a toy's to that of a human's, and their eyes began to move. Force, who had the highest sequence, recovered the fastest. Looking around, she was extremely surprised to find that she had unknowingly come to a flat by the side of the river from that apartment. Furthermore, this change was only limited to her overall area. The situation around her was no different from before. Where am I? What happened? Force's gaze landed on the empty altar. After pondering for a second, she seemed to understand something as she asked in surprise, "Has the matter ended?" "Yes," replied Audrey, who was using her psychological invisibility. "It's ended. It's ended." Force followed up with a confused and dazed question. "How's the target?" "He's dead." Audrey was multitasking as she controlled the other 6 beyonders. Her answer was very simple. "He's dead. Saint of Secrets Botis has died. I didn't participate in the battle. I didn't summon German Sparrow's historical void projection." Force's mouth gaped slightly as she felt like she was dreaming. She only felt that she had been terrified for a second and was in a daze for a moment, and the mission had already been completed. At this moment, she saw the surrounding beyonders come to life, but they didn't show any surprise towards the change in environment. It was as if the gathering had been held here. They skillfully destroyed the chairs and long tables and threw them into the Tussock River. Then, they left the flats one after another and returned home under the illumination of the street lamps. This is a manipulator. How terrifying. Force jumped in fright and completely snapped awake. Return first. Audrey didn't have time to explain. She turned around and used the altar from before, preparing to sacrifice the box of the Great Old Ones above the grey fog. Force shot a look over, but she didn't ask or say anything. She made her body turn transparent as she vanished from where she was. Author's note: the title of this chapter originally should have been Official Debut, but it was just not serious enough. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1203. In the ancient palace above the fog. Dark red starlight shot up, forming several figures. Leonard did a casual glance, and his gaze suddenly froze on the silver-black jewelry box placed on the long mottled table. If he recalled correctly, this was likely a Grade 0 sealed artifact, the box of the Great Old Ones that the world Klein Moretti had specially emphasized during the prior private gathering. The Saint of Secrets was really in control of this Grade 0 sealed artifact. And he even used it? Yet, Hermit and Miss Justice succeeded? Leonard's pupils dilated slightly as he nearly couldn't believe his eyes. As an official Beyonder, a red-glove captain of the Church of Evernight, he knew Grade 0 sealed artifacts very well. he knew that these items could easily destroy a city, causing people to suddenly die without putting up any resistance. When facing them, not only was contact with them impossible, but even understanding them was something that should be reduced if possible. Leonard originally believed that Hermit and Miss Justice would leave the battlefield according to the plan after encountering a Grade 0 sealed artifact. They would then think of a way to rescue Miss Magician. To his surprise, they had succeeded and had even retrieved the Grade 0 sealed artifact. Hermit's mystical reenactment has reached such a high level. Did the Feast of Betrayal she mentioned really make the sealed artifact rebel? Or could it be that Mr. Fool had provided some help? Leonard muttered silently as he glanced at the world Klein Moretti, who was seated at the bottom end of the long bronze table. He discovered that his former colleague was rather calm. Klein surveyed the area and said, "Congratulations, everyone. The hunt this time was very successful. All the spoils of war are here." As he spoke, he raised his right hand, condensing various bits of mysterious knowledge into a pale white luster. He also included a small number of legends that came from the East, such as Peach Blossom Spring and Lanks Go Match. He wanted Hermit to test if they were mystical or not, and whether there was any real source. This is your reward." The world Klein made the pale white light fly towards the Hermit Catlear. Then he pointed at the box of the Great Old Ones, the secret sorcerer's beyond a characteristic, the traveler's luggage, Botis's eyeballs, 9 worms of star, large amounts of gems and materials on the table. In addition, you have the right to choose first. After the battle at the demigod level with the Saint of Secrets, Catlear finally found the bearing and confidence of a saint. She first received the pale white glow and closed her eyes to digest the mysterious knowledge contained within. In the second epoch, the ancient gods believed that the original creator, the oldest one, left some objects behind. Perhaps it was a kingdom formed from a portion of his body or something that he created. There are 9 of these that contain the various Sephiro. They are the Chaos Sea, Sapphira Castle, River of Eternal Darkness, Knowledge Moor, Tenebrous World, Brood Hive, Nation of Disorder, City of Calamity, and the Key of Light. The ancient sun god came from a place known as Chernobyl. The Marauder Pathway Sequence 0 is called Error. Emperor Razel's fairytales might have originated from something that happened before. As the mysticism knowledge resonated in her, Catlear couldn't help but open her eyes and look at the world German sparrow. There were too many things inside that shocked her, making her realize that she had opened the door to a whole new world. I never thought of Mr. Fool's origins in the past. Now, I can vaguely grasp it. A thought flashed through Catlear's mind as she had a guess. She immediately controlled herself. She didn't want to think too much, nor did she dare to think too deeply about it. She was afraid that she would come up with an answer that was enough to make her lose control. This is one of the 9 Sephiro. Mr. Fool's goal is to gather all the Sephiro and attempt to recover. Raising her right hand, she nudged her heavy glasses on her nose bridge. Catlear forced herself to focus her attention on the small tails and decided to return to the real world to completely digest the potion before she attempted to create magic with them, allowing her to draw on their power using mystical reenactment. Of course, she also believed that not every one of them would succeed. She believed that a portion of those stories were purely fabricated. After all, this was a gift from Mr. World. There was no guarantee that they would be effective. After all, out of the many fairy tales and ancient legends that Emperor Razel recounted to Queen Mystic back then, only a few of them truly produced magic. She took a few seconds to compose herself and cast her gaze to the middle of the long mottled table, preparing to choose her spoil of war. Without a doubt, the most eye-catching item was the box of the Great Old Ones labeled 0 to 61. The silver-black jewelry box embedded with many gems completely overshadowed all the other items. Catlear wasn't too unfamiliar with Grade 0 sealed artifacts, because Queen Mystic had more than one. It was also because of this reason that the Queen's Element Dawn was able to compete with the ancient organization, Moses Ascetic Order, that had been born in the early 4th epoch. The gap between an angel and a saint was not something the magic of a powerful fairy tale could make up for. To become a truly powerful figure, one had to advance to Sequence 2 or possess a Grade 0 sealed artifact. It wasn't that Cat Lear didn't have any desire for the box of the Great Old Ones, but when she thought of the hint that the World German Sparrow had received from Mr. Fool, the terrifying negative effects, the third level's extreme danger, and most of the beyonder powers that she couldn't control, she felt a sense of horror. Although she had brief luck, she still lacked the ability to seal the box of the Great Old Ones so far. After a series of intense struggles, the hermit Cat Lear pointed at the dreamy crystal and said, "I want the secret sorcerer's beyonder characteristic. If they could find a suitable high-sequence artisan, it could be transformed into a rather good sealed artifact, one that had barely acceptable negative effects." Queen Mystic Bernadette happened to have the resources to do so, but the commission might not necessarily succeed. In the end, even if there's only teleportation, that will be enough. However, it's obvious that a secret sorcerer wouldn't only be able to grasp teleportation. Even if the negative effects are excessive, I can get Queen Mystic to shatter and try again, or I could sell it to Miss Magician. Yes, she said that her teacher would prepare the ingredients for her. Following that, Cat Lear nodded at the World German Sparrow to confirm her choice. Choosing the secret sorcerer's beyonder characteristic? Upon hearing Hermit's reply, a scene appeared in Klein's mind. Wearing a purple-patterned black robe, the lady wearing a dark-colored had relied on Blink to leave behind many doppelgangers. Then, they would all ignite a match at the same time. The little match girl will turn into countless witches selling matchsticks. This is a horrifying fairy tale. The world Klein couldn't help but twitch the corners of his mouth as he tersely acknowledged. "All right, it's your right." He then cast his gaze at Miss Magician. "It's your turn to choose." "I didn't do anything," Force said guiltily. Klein scoffed and said, "You successfully acted as bait." Force didn't know what expression she should use to respond, but she heard Mr. Star seemingly laugh. She slowly took a deep breath and cast her gaze at the spoils of war on the long bronze table. Frankly speaking, she wanted to choose the box of the Great Old Ones because it was an item that her teacher's family had snatched away. She didn't want to use it herself, she wanted to return it to her teacher directly. However, considering that she was only bait, Force felt that she was not qualified to take an item of this level. Grade 0 sealed artifacts were extremely rare, precious, and dangerous. She had already gained a deep impression of them with Mr. Star's introduction. She knew that the value of the box of the Great Old Ones was definitely not something a saint's beyonder characteristic could compare with. With this in mind, she chose Under the World German Sparrow's watch. Force finally gave up the impulse and pointed at the pair of eyeballs. "I'll take them." She wanted to bring the pair of eyes to her teacher and tell him that Botis was dead. It was an end to all the hatred. In addition to such a value of the item, Botis's eye could be made into a powerful hex item or be used as a medium for a curse. It was considered a pretty good item. Klein nodded slightly and did not persuade her. He only pointed at the gems, materials, and the worms of Star and said calmly, "You also paid the price of a moon paper figurine, you can choose something to make up for it." "All right." Force reflexively agreed. As the apprentice pathway needed gems for several charms and rituals and could still be appreciated normally, Force took a portion of the gems and waited for the bestowment ceremony to obtain them. With that, Klein shifted his gaze and said to Miss Judgment, "It's your turn." Zio also knew that she had not contributed much, and she knew that she had no ability to withstand the negative effects of the box of the Great Old Ones, so she didn't even take a look at 0 to 61 and pointed to the black pocket. "I'll choose Traveler's Bag." This way, she could carry heavy weapons with her and might even be able to pull out a cannon at a critical moment. As for the problem of strengthening the hidden space after a period of time, she had also considered it. After all, she could still use it for about a year for the time being. In the future, she could rent a sealed artifact from Hermit to maintain it. Furthermore, at that time, Force might have already become a secret sorcerer. The world Klein nodded and looked at the star Leonard. "It's your turn." Leonard did not stand on ceremony. He scanned the area and tapped a few times. 3 worms of Star, 20 gems, and those ingredients. This feels like I'm paying protection fees to the official organizations. After lampooning his dear poet, Klein turned to Miss Justice and said, "The mission was very successful and I'm very satisfied. Although you have already received your payment, you can still choose a little more." Audrey could decipher the sincerity of Mr. World's words. Without any excuses, she chose a worm of star and a third of the spiritual materials. Discover new chapters at novelbin.com. At this point, as the mission's commissioner, the World German Sparrow had obtained 5 worms of star, a grade 0 sealed artifact, a third of the spiritual materials, and nearly 30 high-quality gems. He smiled and looked at Force. "Remember to tell your teacher about this. Just say that this is a gesture of my goodwill. And I want to make a deal with him." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1204. Force wasn't surprised by Mr. World's request. She nervously replied, all right. What kind of deal is it exactly?" During this period of time, she had communicated with her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, several times. Under Miss Justice's guidance, she had laid quite a lot of foundation for the impending request. The World Klein laughed hoarsely. "You don't have to tell him what I want for now. Just lay out my chips for him and see if he's interested. Your bargaining chip is still the promise to break the Abraham family's curse?" Force cautiously sought confirmation. Klein nodded and pointed at 0 to 61 on the long wattle table. "It can also be this box of the great old ones. An item used to exchange for a grade 0 sealed artifact can't be simple." Be it Justice Audrey or the hermit Catlear, both of them suddenly had such a realization. However, Force paid more attention to the promise of breaking the curse. This was because she had experienced it herself and knew how tragic her teacher's family was. She replied solemnly without hesitation, "All right. Backland, West Borough, in the basement of a house." St. Tenebrous, who was hidden in the shadows, suddenly grew out of the darkness. He turned his head as if he was listening to something. The muscles on his cheeks began to twitch. It wasn't just one chunk of flesh, but bits. Not only were they not connected to each other, but they were also interfering with each other. It looked extremely odd. In seconds, Kisma wore an extremely painful expression as his skin tore apart, as flesh and blood beneath squirmed, mixed with a deep black. With a thud, he fell to the ground and prostrated himself before the altar, vomiting out large amounts of organs and shimmering light. St. Tenebrous' head was pressed tightly against the ground as he muttered crazily, "Botis actually died. A secret sorcerer who wields a grade 0 sealed artifact died just like that. There's a tarot card, the Hermit." The 2 enemies that attacked were saints. One was a mysticologist, while the other was a manipulator. The organization that believes in the Fool and uses tarot cards as their code names. German Sparrow. Azikegus. After an uncontrollable murmur, St. Tenebrous Kisma cried, feeling both vexed and pained. "I repent, I repent, I repent." A few days later, in an apartment room in Pritz Harbor, the disguised Dorian Gray Abraham had received a letter from Force through many hands. He examined it carefully and confirmed that there were no issues. After confirming that there were no abnormal signs, he took out the letter with the help of a letter knife. The beginning of the letter was the usual greeting. Following that, Force directly wrote, "We have already killed Saint of Secrets Botis and obtained the items on his person." Dorian had originally planned on scanning through the letter quickly, but he ended up stuck on this sentence. He read it a few times and forgot to continue reading. Dorian knew how strong and powerful Botis was. He also knew very well how terrifying a secret sorcerer was. But now, the new student he had been teaching for over a year had told him in a very calm tone that Botis had already been taken care of. In an instant, the only things that echoed in Dorian's mind were thoughts of impossible, a lie, and a conspiracy. He suspected that Force had already been controlled by the Aurora Order. In any major faction, sequence for Beyond Us were the absolute upper echelons and extremely important members. How could they be so easily killed? Dorian's throat bobbed up and down as he forcefully focused and continued reading the contents of the letter. "We have obtained the box of the great old ones. I believe you aren't unfamiliar with it. After reading another line, Dorian's eyelids twitched a few times. He felt that the letter in his hand was as heavy as a boulder. Of course, he wasn't unfamiliar with the box of the Great Old Ones. This was a Grade 0 sealed artifact of the Abraham family, proof that they had once been glorious. The one that was killed was Botis, who possessed the box of the Great Old Ones. Dorian's shock kept rising. He felt that things had gone beyond his imagination. On the other hand, he felt that there was a possibility that it wasn't impossible. Perhaps the one who really killed Botis was actually the box of the Great Old Ones. He knew very well how dangerous that Grade 0 sealed artifact was. At the same time, he finally noticed a word, we. This was the first time Force had indicated that she had companions and partners. Of course, Dorian had already guessed it, but he hadn't called her out. Indeed. Dorian sighed and eagerly read the rest. I have a friend who wants to show you his goodwill by pushing for this operation against Botis. He said that he wants to make a deal with you, and is willing to use the box of the Great Old Ones or a promise to remove the Abraham family's curse in exchange. He wonders if you are interested. He doesn't know where you are, and I won't tell him. You can totally refuse. A promise to remove the curse? Dorian skipped over the box of the Great Old Ones and ruminated on the extremely important part of the sentence. After the first few letters, he had fully understood the true nature of the family's curse. It was both a sorrowful and helpless matter, a glimmer of hope that was brewed out of the pain. Before this, who would have thought that the person who caused the descendants of the Abraham family to lose control would be their ancestors' cry for help? This was like a cruel joke from fate. Dorian didn't know if Mr. Dorr knew the consequences of his actions, nor did he know how to describe his complicated feelings. However, he couldn't help but start searching for a way to make Mr. Dorr return and completely remove the family curse. This was a path with very slim hope, but for the Abraham family, it was enough, because a light had finally appeared in the darkness. After an unknown period of time, Dorian folded the letter and smiled bitterly to himself. Goodwill. Such goodwill is frightening. After he muttered to himself, he fell into silence again. His expression was gloomy and his heart seemed to be struggling. Gong! The sound of the wall clock rang punctually, snapping Dorian out of his daze. His expression gradually became solemn and he finally made a decision. After making up his mind, Dorian felt much more relaxed. He even smiled. He first burned Force letter before packing his bag and heading out to the steam locomotive station in Pritz Harbor. He was going to Southville, but not to hide, but to make some preparations. He planned on handing all his family's items and potion formulas to one of the family members who was staying there before returning to Pritz Harbor. With his identity as Dorian Gray, he would head to Backlund to meet his student, Force, and the powerhouse who had shown his goodwill. When the time came, he would consume a type of medicine in advance to allow himself to suffer a powerful curse that rooted itself in his spirit body. He would have to regularly consume another type of medicine to maintain his life. This way, even if he was controlled and unable to commit suicide, he would quickly die because he had no chance to take the medicine. With his spirit body dissipating, he wouldn't leak any key information. For this journey, Dorian had put life and death aside. He was willing to sacrifice his life for that slim hope. Northborough in Backlund, beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. Leonard, who had just had a discussion with the members of the mandated Punishers, the Machinery Hivemind, and MI9, returned to his office and sat down. At that moment, the slightly aged voice of Pallas Zoroast resounded in his mind. They finally found the exact location of the Jacob family's treasure trove and are about to enter. Ah? Leonard was momentarily stunned, unable to react. Previously, at the gathering of the Hermits of Fate, he had sold the news of the Jacob family's treasure trove. As no one knew what was inside, no one was willing to offer a high price. And Leonard's main goal was not to trade, so he had only exchanged it for some rare spirits. He immediately lowered his voice and said, "Old man, how do you know that?" It's a given that I sent out my avatar to monitor the area," Pallas Zoroast replied unhappily. "Are you underestimating an angel from the Marauder pathway?" Leonard laughed dryly. Old man, you've recovered quite well. You even have excess characteristics for an avatar. Check out latest novels on novel/bin.com. I'm already at the level of a sequence too. Palace Zoroas scoffed. Next, don't go out. Just stay inside the cathedral to prevent any accidents from happening. Are you worried that a trap lies within the treasure? Leonard asked thoughtfully. How can a treasure left behind by a marauder angel not have a trap? Palace Zoroas said with a scoff. I can't predict what will happen, but staying underground in the cathedral is definitely safe. Leonard nodded and suppressed his voice. Let's hope everything goes smoothly. Old man, you promise me that if you can successfully obtain a sequence 2 beyond a characteristic, you will steal a grade 1 sealed artifact from the items they obtained for me. It wasn't that he was concerned about whether he reaped anything out of it, but rather it was to ease his sudden anxiety. Weren't you against stealing? After a mocking remark, Palace fell silent, as if he was focused on monitoring the situation at the Jacob family's treasure trove. About an hour later, he heaved a sigh of relief in Leonard's mind. Although there were many traps and accidents, they eventually reached the predetermined target. I only took that characteristic and a sealed artifact. The rest will be their payment. Don't be in a hurry to leave this place. Wait until I absorb that characteristic before leaving. When that happens, there won't be any problems. Leonard immediately relaxed and leaned back, crossing his legs as he read the newspaper leisurely. In the evening, Palace Zoroast finally spoke again. It's done. His voice contained plenty of emotions, but because it was too complicated, Leonard was unable to tell. Seeing that nothing had happened and that old man might still need to digest, Leonard stood up and rubbed his temples. He left St. Samuel Cathedral and returned to 7 Pinster Street. As he passed through the porch, he suddenly saw a person sitting on the sofa. The man was wearing a classic black robe and a pointed hat. He placed his right leg over his left and was leisurely reading a newspaper. As if sensing Leonard's arrival, that person raised his head and adjusted the monocle on his right eye, revealing a teasing smile. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1205. Amorn. Blasphemer Amorn. Leonard was no stranger to the person in front of him. Not only had he faced his avatar, but he had also heard of his various deeds and nasty character from Old Man Palace Zoroast. At that moment, Leonard's thoughts nearly froze as his mind went blank. Only a small number of thoughts could spin. Amorn's lips suddenly quivered as he muttered a raving that was completely at the level of a deity. Discover new chapters on N0VEL-bin.com. One voice after another echoed in Leonard's mind as though it came from the countless number of Amorns. Are you pleasantly surprised? Are you shocked? After realizing that I won't be able to get Sapphira Castle anytime soon, I shifted my focus to Backland. If it wasn't to fool all of you, why would I have played such a simple cat-and-mouse game with him? I think you two should be in contact. He must have told you that I'm still tracking him and sabotaging his operations, that I even set a trap for him at his destinations. That's just an avatar that's close to Sequence 1. Ah, right. Palace, I forgot to tell you that in the later years of the Fourth Epoch, I pretended to be the ancestor of the Jacob family. I had long swallowed him in secret. Then, I watched Fizzy descendants panic. Then, I thought of a way to add another secret treasure trove to the place where Tudor became Blood Emperor. I didn't finish off these fellows, because I had a premonition that this treasure trove would be very useful. I had an avatar that had been sleeping there for more than 1,000 years, patiently waiting for someone to open the treasure trove. As for the other avatars, I didn't synchronize this information to them. That way, I might be able to create a ruse at some point in time. Yes, this kind of a synchronization is something I invented. Palace, you're quite behind the times. In order to confirm your whereabouts, I watched that bunch of fellows destroy the traps and take the items away. I watched your avatar steal the characteristic and sealed artifact from their hands. I watched Jimmy carefully devour and digest it. Now, my patience has finally paid off. I guess you must be thinking of how to stall for time and wait for a deity's descent. These voices overlapped each other, tearing through Leonard's thoughts and hurting his soul. It made his head swell and contract, causing a bunch of short black hair to grow on his face. It made his ribs and waist bulge as though it was about to form a new body. With just the ravings alone, Leonard was close to losing control. He was in extreme pain and had no means of resisting. This was the son of the Creator, a king of angels. At the same time, 7 Pinster Street changed. At some point in time, pitch-black stone pillars were erected around them, propping up a majestic cathedral. Each column of the cathedral was embedded with the bones of different races. They were densely packed as they used different eye sockets to stare at the puny Leonard, who stood in the middle as though they were conducting a trial. Amorn stood in front of the cross that was more than 100 meters tall in the depths of the church, smiling as he looked at Leonard's grimacing face. "This corpse cathedral is pretty good, isn't it? I just stole it not long ago. This way, if they wish to discover any abnormalities here and do a deity's descent, it can stall for at least 30 seconds. That's enough." As he spoke, Amorn raised his hand to pinch the crystal monocle that had a beaming face underneath it. Leonard suddenly heard a gong. It was ethereal, as though it came from an infinite distance away. This caused the ear-piercing ravings that tainted Leonard's spirit body to come to an abrupt stop as everything around him turned silent. In Leonard's eyes, beams of light shot out from his body, condensing into a pure figure that was like a wingless angel. The figure was also 100 meters tall, and its body constantly coruscated with a faint glow, as though it was announcing the passage of time. With that, Leonard's body was pushed by an invisible force as he flew towards the door of the corpse cathedral. On the door, transparent and distorted faces appeared. They sealed the inside from the outside, isolating it from the spirit world and the astral world. Gong! Another bell rang. The transparent faces filled with pain froze. Leonard's figure was no longer obstructed. In this short span of time, he passed through the main door of the corpse cathedral without feeling anything. Everything he saw instantly returned to normal. There was still a bit of light high up in the sky. The gas lamps by the side of the streets were already emitting light, illuminating 7 Pinster Street. From the outside, the building was silent, quiet, and dark. There was nobody around. Old man. It was only at this moment that Leonard finally found his train of thought. His heart tightened as he strode forward and returned to the house. However, the door to 7 Pinster Street was so heavy that he couldn't open it any time soon. With this obstruction, Leonard finally regained some of his senses. He hurriedly retreated as he quickly thought of what he could do to save Old Man. After a few steps, he stopped and lowered his head with a solemn expression. He quickly chanted in Jotun, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. Leonard already knew that the one inside was Amorn's true body. And to deal with Amorn's true body, he could only seek help from a god. Walking through the darkness with the lantern in hand, Klein entered the historical fog immediately. Then, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog. After listening to Leonard's prayer, the puzzled and nonchalant-looking Klein instantly sobered up. It was as if he had just woken up from hibernation and had just climbed out of bed when he was splashed with a basin of cold water. Amorn's true body has gone to Backland. Amorn's true body has found Leonard and Pallas. Amorn stole the corpse cathedral from his brother and used it to delay a divine descent. So it turns out that when he suggested that we play the game of who will be the first to find Black Demonic Wolf Kota, he had never thought of deciding on a winner. He didn't care what the stakes were either. His goal was to draw my attention and believe that he is still pursuing me and trying to steal Sapphira Castle from me. The trap hidden in the Jacob family's treasure trove was planted by Amorn for 1,000 to 2,000 years. It has finally come into play. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he raised his right hand and summoned an item from the junk pile. 0 to 61 box of the Great Old Ones. This was a Grade 0 sealed artifact, and it was also from the apprentice pathway. It could better utilize the power of Sapphira Castle and produce better results. In the face of Amorn's true body, this might bring Pallas some hope. At the same time, through the prayer light, Klein confirmed that Leonard hadn't been possessed by Amorn. He immediately instructed in the tone of Mr. Fool, leave the scene and go to an Evernight cathedral. Also, pray to Evernight. A pinnacle sequence battle beneath deities was definitely not something that a Beyonder at Leonard's level could participate in. Even though Klein had gained some initial control of Sapphira Castle and held 0 to 61, he didn't have much confidence. He only hoped that he could stall for time until a deity's descent happened. Outside 7, Pinster Street, Leonard heard Mr. Fool's words echoing in his ears. He was stunned for a moment before he looked up at the tightly shut door. Then, he turned around and used his right knuckle to ruthlessly knock on a certain tooth. A series of illusory mud surged out and sprayed onto the top of Leonard's head, enveloping him from top to bottom. Suddenly, Leonard seemed to transform into a mud doll as he kept sinking to the ground and fusing into the earth. This was a rare natural spirit he had exchanged from the Hermit of Fate. It didn't contain any Beyonder characteristics, and its powers mainly came from the spirit world. It allowed Leonard to quickly traverse the soil at a speed far faster than the steam metro. As Leonard left the battlefield, Klein had picked up the gem-embedded box of the Great Old Ones. He stirred the power of Sapphira Castle and cast his gaze at the pitch-black church that overlapped with the embedded bones. The cathedral isolated his true vision, preventing him from seeing the situation inside. He could only determine that the battle had yet to end through the flashes of light that the stained glass let through. Use 0-61's first level's powers to swap its interior space with the Corpse Cathedral. No, isn't this equivalent to letting Amorn enter Sapphira Castle? Just the first level of the box of the Great Old Ones cannot imprison him. Activate the second level and move the entire 7, Pinster Street somewhere else? No, it won't work either. Once we leave Backland, there won't be a timely divine descent. It will be even more dangerous for Palace Zoroast. Third level? Opening it might lead to a switch in owners of Sapphira Castle. As his thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein came up with an idea. He wanted to narrow the target area to a tiny point and exert pressure on it to crack it. He wanted to exchange the Corpse Cathedral's door and the space in the first level of the box of the Great Old Ones using Sapphira Castle, so that the seal that isolated the spirit world and the astral world would be ineffective. If that was the case, the deities would realize the situation and accelerate the speed of a deity's descent. At the end of the long, mottled table, Klein sat in his high-back chair and aimed at the crimson star representing Leonard as he opened the first level of the box of the Great Old Ones. The surging power in Sapphira Castle suddenly calmed down, returning to its usual concealment as it silently pierced through the crimson star. In the real world at 7, Pinster Street, the door of the Corpse Cathedral that overlapped with ordinary buildings lost its luster. Following that, it became a light pool with gravel and cobblestone. The situation inside and outside suddenly cleared up, and it was reflected in Klein's eyes. In front of the cross that was 100 meters tall, the black-robed, pointed hat, and a monocled Amorn slowly turned around to the open door. He held a crystal pillar formed from light and shadows in his hands. There were many 12-ringed worms of time swimming rapidly inside. Everything around them seemed to stop. Amorn raised his head and looked up into the sky as the corners of his mouth curled up. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1206. Too late? After Klein's heart sank, he suddenly felt the box of the Great Old Ones in his hand shake violently. He hurriedly looked down and saw that the surface of the Corpse Cathedral's door, which had shrunken into a toy, emitted rays of light. Every twisted face on the white skull seemed to come alive. Adam's Corpse Cathedral has such a high level. It can withstand the first level of 0 to 61 with just one door? Without any hesitation, Klein used the crimson star representing Leonard and locked onto a gas lamp on 7, Pinster Street. Suddenly, the door with white bones protruding out with a distorted face returned to the real world. And on the first level of the box of the Great Old Ones, there was an additional toy street lamp. Right on the heels of that, Klein aimed at the Amorn inside the Corpse Cathedral as he swiped his right hand, opening the second level of 0 to 61. At that moment, Palace Zoroast was no longer present on the battlefield. Without any qualms, Klein could move Amon elsewhere. He had designated the destination to be the astral world, hoping that the 7 deities would show him their love, but it was unknown if there would be a random anomaly. Discover new chapters on n0velbin.com. At this moment, the door returned to the Corpse Cathedral. Then, the majestic building that overlapped with 7 Pinster Street quickly disintegrated. The process of the collapse was very organized. First, it began from the dome, followed by the arches and the walls. It finally ended with the pitch-black stone pillars. The item that fell didn't hit the ground and instead disappeared in midair. Standing in front of the cross, Amon also began to dissipate along with the collapse of the entire Corpse Cathedral. It was as though he had also been envisioned, an entity that could be removed at any time. Of course, Klein knew very well that this was only Amon exploiting a loophole to use the expiration of the imagined Corpse Cathedral, so as to also become a figment of imagination to leave Backland. Boom! At some point in time, a thick dark cloud appeared in midair. A ball of lightning the size of a house dragged a silvery white stream of light as it ruthlessly smashed onto the Corpse Cathedral and Amon's body that had not completely disintegrated. A fine crack appeared on Amon's crystal monocle as the pointed hat on his head collapsed. However, this angel of time didn't panic. When his face twitched uncontrollably, he maintained his smile and held the crystal pillar formed from light and shadows. Like an illusion, he completely disintegrated as the sea of light that filled the Corpse Cathedral vanished. In the next second, the pitch-black and bone-embedded towering cathedral returned to the realm of fantasy. The house on 7 Pinster Street remained, but there were exaggerated marks on the living room's floor. The mark was like a person lying there, having turned to ashes. This was left behind by the countless avatars of Amon after they were smitten apart. However, Klein knew that Amon's true body had successfully escaped and had achieved his desired goal. When he recovered, this king of angels was just short of a ritual to reach the divine throne and become the embodiment of all that was erroneous in the world. After I swapped the main door of the Corpse Cathedral, the first one to notice and react with his powers was the Lord of Storms. The goddess really has no way of performing a divine descent. She can only use various mediums to interfere with reality, making it difficult for her to affect him when he is prepared. I was still feeling happy for myself that I managed to escape from Amon. I was satisfied that I had repeatedly avoided him and didn't fall into his traps, but in the end, he ended up pulling off such a huge stunt without any prior warning. When did he transfer his focus to Backland? It should be after I deceived the laws to resurrect elsewhere. He caught a hint of Palace Zoroast, as well as the fact that there's a connection between him and me. He began to target the last sequence one beyond a characteristic so as to become a true god. Back then, Leonard didn't explain in detail when he was praying. He only mentioned that there was a problem with the treasure trove of the Jacob family. For a sequence 1 angel who's so familiar with Amon to not notice anything amiss and fall into the trap, Amon must have done something incredible again. Phew, although I've rapidly grown in my battle of wits with Amon and completed a transformation, I'm still far from being a top swindler like him. I'm still too tender? Once Amon becomes a sequence 0 error and can even traverse the land, it will be tough for me. No, I have to figure out the Marauder Pathways ritual to become a god. I need to think of a way to do some damage. I can't let Amon easily ascend to the divine throne. But can this be what Amon wants? He will deliberately hold a ritual and wait for me to knock on his doorstep. As his thoughts raced, Klein let out a long sigh. Then, he sent a message to Leonard in the tone of the fool. There's no need to pray. In St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard had just emerged from the soil in the garden. He was trying to rush into the prayer hall when he heard Mr. Fool's words. There's no need to pray. Leonard slowed down as he repeated the sentence in a daze. He slowed down and finally stopped beside a stone pillar. He lowered his head and raised his hands to cover his face. At this moment, a slightly aged voice suddenly echoed in his mind. What are you sad about? I haven't died yet. Ah? Leonard released his hands and said in a daze and pleasant surprise, Old man, you haven't died yet. His eyes were already slightly red. Look at you, what are you saying? Pallas Zoroaster's voice was clearly weak. Ahum, to put it simply, I've died once, but not entirely yet. Leonard finally heaved a sigh of relief and looked around. Seeing that no one was paying attention, he lowered his voice and said, "Did you successfully deceive Amorn?" "I can't really call it deceiving." Pallas Zoroaster sighed and said, "All these years, the thing I've thought about the most is what I should do if Amorn's true body finds me. After repeated experiments, I've also created a technique. After my true body dies, I can revive in my avatar. However, I will lose the sequence 1 beyond a characteristic and passively lower my level. I haven't been left behind by the times either. In other words, Amorn killed you once and obtained your sequence 1 characteristic while you resurrected at the sequence 2 level." Leonard had a rough idea of what was going on as he asked in confirmation. Pallas Zoroaster sighed and replied, "Something like that. Actually, it's not like Amorn didn't notice it. He didn't do anything to stop it when I pushed you out of the corpse cathedral. He just wanted to leave some hope for me and make me lose my will to fight to the death in the upcoming battle. If not for that, I wouldn't have been finished by him so quickly. After all, I'd basically recovered after absorbing the treasure troves beyond a characteristic." Leonard blurted out in surprise, "Old man, you pushed me out of the corpse cathedral because I have your avatar in me?" Pallas immediately scoffed. "What do you think? Do you really think I'm treating you like a grandson? Don't you have other avatars?" Leonard muttered. Pallas grunted and sighed. Amorn actually lied to his avatar. I must admit that he pulled a fast one on me. If it wasn't for the fact that he learned that the Angel of Time didn't know the exact situation of the Jacob family's treasure trove back when he absorbed Amorn's avatars, he definitely would have taken more caution on the matter and would have made more adequate preparations for Amorn's appearance. This was the most important reason. As for the other matters regarding the Jacob family's ancestor or Klein Moretti playing hide-and-seek with Amorn's true body in the forsaken land of the gods, none of them were key in him making up his mind. Leonard thought for a moment and consoled, "Old man, you would have fallen for this most fatal of traps in the treasure trove regardless, so it isn't bad for you to have survived it." "That's not it," Pallas immediately refuted. "If I had a premonition that something dangerous would happen, I would have directly taken up the faith of a true god and become their grounded angel. With their protection, I would head to Jacob family's treasure trove. After I absorbed the characteristic and regained the strength of a sequence 1, I was considering this problem. Should I join the Church of Evernite, or work with the fool of yours, or remove the parasitizing and hide from Amorn like before?" Upon saying this, his emotions became very complicated again. Old man really has quite a plan. Why are you so familiar with seeking refuge from a deity? Leonard sighed inwardly as he focused his attention on the most important matter. "Old man, after Amorn obtained your sequence 1 beyond a characteristic, will he be preparing the apotheosis ritual?" "Yes." Pallas replied in a deep voice, "This means that, for a very long period of time, your former colleague and ourselves would, at most, be harassed by Amorn's lower-level avatars, or nothing at all. What is the requirement of his apotheosis ritual?" Leonard pressed. Pallas fell silent for a second before saying, "To replace someone during their apotheosis ritual." At this point, Pallas laughed self-deprecatingly. "Amorn's next focus will definitely be the apotheosis ritual. This will be our last moments of peace and quiet. Once he becomes a god, he will definitely come to you to deal with the fool through you. Although I can abandon you and run ahead of time, I have to worry that he has the intention of retrieving all the characteristics at the angel level. Gain control of those rare spirits as soon as possible, digest the potion, and become a demigod. Wield a holy artifact, and obtain the favor of Evernite." Leonard's expression turned serious as he slowly nodded. He immediately found a quiet spot and informed Mr. Fool through a prayer of the key information. "Someone else's apotheosis ritual? The only one who seems to be able to become a god anytime soon is Adam. It's good if the two brothers end up fighting. The final period of peace. I hope that the avatars that Amorn leaves behind to interfere with me won't be too strong. I hope that I can find traces of the dark demonic wolf as soon as possible. I hope that Dorian will agree to the deal. Klein sighed and returned to the real world. He continued walking in the dark with his lantern raised. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1207. Backland, Sherwood Borough. 22, Hope Street, Hat Trick Inn. With broad shoulders and thick arms, Dorian Gray Abraham unknowingly paced back and forth in the room, waiting for his student, Force, to visit. No matter how composed and mentally prepared he was, he couldn't help but feel nervous and uneasy when he eventually needed to face the answer. After an unknown period of time, there was a series of knocks on the door. Dorian listened to the rhythm for a few seconds before taking a deep breath. He walked to the door, twisted the handle, and pulled it back. Outside the door was the brown-haired, curly-haired Force, who was wearing a dark-colored long dress and a pair of tinted glasses. Dorian habitually looked behind Force, and after confirming that no one was looking in their direction, he made way for his student to pass. At the same time, he glanced at Force's hands and realized that his student wasn't carrying any luggage. Dorian retracted his gaze and walked to the middle of the room. He found a seat and sat down before pointing to the sofa opposite him. "Have a seat." Force cautiously lifted the ends of her skirt slightly, sat down, and greeted, "Good morning, teacher." Dorian didn't go straight to the point. After some thought, he said, "Did a lot of you really kill Botis?" "Yes." Force took out an exquisite, long cigar case from her pocket and opened it to show Dorian its interior. It was a pair of dark black eyes that were frozen with indescribable horror, as though they had seen something extremely terrifying before they died. Dorian had originally been mentally prepared. It was just like receiving the terrifying head that would cause nightmares the previous time, one that was put together one bloody fragment at a time. He never expected his student to not carry any luggage and to only take out a lady's cigar case. This made him believe that it was a relic that could prove Botis's identity, but the truth was beyond his expectations once again. This was still Botis's corpse, but there was even less than what Louis Veen left behind. Only a pair of eyes are left. The spiritual intuition of an astrologer convinced Dorian that the eyeball belonged to Botis. Seeing that the teacher had fallen silent, Force subconsciously explained, "His body has completely collapsed and dissipated. Only this pair of eyeballs is still intact." She paused for a moment before saying, "These eyeballs contain the remnants of the terror and contamination of the box of the Great Old Ones before Botis's passing. It's a very strong cursed item, so I didn't send it directly to you. It would cause terrible things to happen to the postman, and he might even die unknowingly. The corruption of the box of the Great Old Ones." Dorian nodded in enlightenment and sighed with a smile. Did he eventually die under the hands of the box of the Great Old Ones? This is really fate. The first item that Botis had stolen after his betrayal from leading the Aurora Order over was the box of the Great Old Ones. Force had heard Hermit's and Miss Justice's description of the general situation at the private gathering where they distributed the spoils of war. She learned how gorgeous and dangerous the battle she had missed was. She thought for a moment and said, "You could say that." However, before he was contaminated by the box of the Great Old Ones, he had already begun losing control. Dorian wasn't surprised as he said to his student, "Keep it. This is a spoil of war you deserve." After Force closed the cigar case and placed it back into her pocket, Dorian leaned forward, clasped his hands, and touched his nose. Botis was one of the most talented apprentices I have ever seen. Who knew that he would end up like this? Having said that, Dorian let out a long sigh as though he was recalling and confessing something. Force didn't know much about the details of what had happened back then, so she didn't dare to speak recklessly. She could only remain silent and wait for her teacher to recover from his mixed emotions. 10 seconds later, Dorian straightened his body and asked, "How did you digest the scribe potion?" This wasn't only to show concern for his student, but also to accumulate experience to provide some guidance to the other members of the family. Force's expression immediately turned complicated as though she was recalling something she didn't wish to recall. "It's mainly because someone had provided me with help. On the one hand, I recorded a lot of unique or high-level abilities. On the other hand, I was brought to many places in the past few months where I recorded a different cultures and beautiful scenery. Dorian fell silent for a moment before nodding. This isn't easy to imitate. He then asked, German Sparrow? Yes. Force gave an affirmative response. Dorian fell silent again. A few seconds later, he said, what kind of deal does he want to make? Or rather, what does he want? Force focused her attention and answered in an embarrassed manner, he wants the potion formula of a planeswalker, and he plans on using the box of the Great Old Ones to exchange for one of the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts in your family's hands. This price was definitely a generous offer. Force had originally thought that Mr. World was going to use a promise to exchange for the planeswalker potion formula and a Grade 0 sealed artifact, but she never expected him to throw in the box of the Great Old Ones. Of course, it was definitely of value to allow the Abraham family to be free of the curse. However, a promise was forever a promise that might not be fulfilled. Dorian wasn't surprised by German Sparrow's request for a Grade 0 sealed artifact. He had long been mentally prepared, and instead, he felt that the conditions were beyond his imagination. After all, the Abraham family didn't have many things that a demigod could covet at this point in time. He frowned slightly and said, why does he want the potion formula of a planeswalker? I don't know, Force answered frankly. Dorian stood up and started pacing. Suddenly, he stopped and looked at Force. I need to meet him and have a chat before I can make a decision. All right. Force agreed without any hesitation. Dorian heaved a sigh of relief and prepared to send his student away before quickly taking out the medicine for his consumption. He had arranged to meet at this time because he had taken into consideration that his curse would happen at any moment. If anything were to happen, the enemy wouldn't be able to channel his spirit in time. However, after Force got up, she didn't walk to the door. She stood on the spot and grabbed at the void. Her arm suddenly sank, and she quickly pulled out a figure wearing a black trench coat and silk top hat. This figure had black hair and brown eyes. His facial features were cut and cold. It was none other than German Sparrow. German Sparrow's eyes moved slightly as he quickly recovered from his sluggish look and became no different from a real person. Teacher, he's here. Force introduced seriously, his German Sparrow. This action left Dorian Gray Abraham slightly agape. He forgot to close his mouth and didn't respond for a moment. Although he came from an ancient family clan and knew many secrets, there were many things he couldn't imagine even if he read the description due to him being only a sequence 7. After moving his consciousness over, Klein reached into his clothes and took out a golden pocket watch. Pa! He opened his pocket watch and took a look. Without any emotions, he said to Dorian, you have 3 minutes. It's exactly as the rumors say. He's cold, arrogant, and crazy. Dorian didn't dare to waste any time and directly said, give me a reason to believe in your promise. As he closed his pocket watch, Klein placed it back into his inner pocket and said, in truth, I'm already aware of the ritual that allows Mr. Dorr to return. Dorian's eyes lit up. Just as he was about to ask, he heard German Sparrow calmly add, but I don't plan to do that. Why? Dorian and Force were puzzled, but one dared to ask while the other didn't. Klein looked out the window and said, do you know about the corruption from the cosmos? When it came to understanding the cosmos, the Abraham family was definitely ranked first outside the true deities and angels. Klein believed that they must have left behind some hints and hidden records. Dorian nodded solemnly and said, yes. I suspect that Mr. Dorr has been corrupted by the cosmos, Klein explained simply. As for my promise, it can be fulfilled right away. However, you might not be willing to do so. Furthermore, it doesn't completely resolve the curse. What's the solution? Dorian asked as he controlled his surging emotions. Klein's expression immediately turned serious. You and your family members will change their faith to my Lord. That way, when the full moon or blood moon happens, you will be blessed and no longer suffer from the curse. After completely digesting the scholar of your potion, there was no need for him to pull a person above the grey fog to avoid Mr. Dorr's ravings. He could directly use Angel's Embrace to resolve the problem. The only thing he needed to worry about now was that there might be too many members of the Abraham family. It might overwhelm him, or he might not have enough spirituality. "Who is your lord?" Dorian asked after a moment of silence. Klein suppressed his shame and said solemnly, "The great Mr. Fool." "The Fool? Are you from the Antigonus family?" Dorian suddenly made some connections. Klein shook his head and rejected his guess. Dorian fell silent again, but considering that there were only 3 minutes left, he hurriedly asked, "If we believe in that entity, we can avoid the troubles brought about by the curse?" As an ancient family member, he knew very well how dangerous it was to believe in an unknown existence. He was afraid that he would resolve Mr. Dawes' ravings, but bring about another curse. Klein answered frankly, "This is just a temporary solution. I will find a better solution for you." Dorian nodded and quickly said, "I will try to believe in your lord and give you the potion formula of Planeswalker. If the curse can really be resolved temporarily, we will complete the transaction of the Grade 0 sealed artifact." He planned on using himself as an experiment to see if the method worked. Furthermore, he didn't plan on telling the other family members. He wanted to get them to wait for German Sparrow's supposedly better solution until they couldn't wait any longer. "All right." Klein took out a pen and paper from his pocket and scribbled the honorific name of the fool. Discover new chapters at novelbin.com. As for Dorian, he also began to use a crystal ball to aid in his memories, recording down the potion formula of Planeswalker. After the exchange, Klein cast his gaze towards the supplementary ingredients and ritual. Supplementary ingredients: 1 worm of star, 1 worm of time, 1 worm of spirit. Advancement ritual: leave legends in 9 places outside this planet. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1208. Leave legends in 9 places other than this planet. Isn't this the cosmos? Looking at the potion formula in his hand, Klein nearly frowned. He felt that this was more dangerous than the advancement ritual of a miracle invoker. Although the box of the Great Old Ones and the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Abraham family, as well as a number of Grade 1 sealed artifacts, had the ability to send people into the cosmos, making the ritual appear simple, he clearly remembered that the Church of Evernight's ascetic leader, Oriana, had once warned him that the cosmos contained extremely terrifying corruption. It was dangerous to even understand it before becoming an angel. One will be corrupted by the cosmos if they aren't a planeswalker, and to become a planeswalker, one has to travel the cosmos. This has become an impasse. There's no way to resolve it. Perhaps, the Abraham family has records of relatively safe locations in the cosmos. I can't be too pessimistic. Also, I have to use divination to verify the authenticity of this formula when I'm back. Dorian not lying to me doesn't mean that he wouldn't be lied to. Klein retracted his gaze and looked at Dorian Gray Abraham opposite him. Check out latest novels on novel/bin.com. Where are all the Planeswalker Beyonder characteristics? Having memorized the fool's honorific name, Dorian thought for 2 seconds before saying, 2 of them are in the form of Grade 0 sealed artifacts in our family. 1 is in the form of the box of the Great Old Ones. 1 is said to be in the hands of the Demonis sect, while another is with the Church of the God of Combat. There is 1 more, but no one has found it since the Second Epoch. If I could use the box of the Great Old Ones to exchange for one of the 2 relatively normal Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Abraham family, I wouldn't have to worry about obtaining the Planeswalker Beyonder characteristic. However, that advancement ritual is truly a problem. Besides, the essence of this ritual is clearly to leave a mark in the cosmos. No matter how many changes are made, I won't be able to bypass the cosmos. Klein controlled his expression and nodded at Dorian. I hope you can find the answer when the Crimson Moon becomes full. With that said, his figure rapidly turned faint, having reached force limit. Upon seeing German Sparrow leave like that, Dorian subconsciously looked down at the piece of paper with the honorific name of the fool in his hand. He realized that it had also turned illusory and disappeared. Dorian was unable to find the correct answer from the various Beyonder powers recorded by his family. He turned to look at Force, opened his mouth, intending to ask her. At that moment, he felt a sudden pain in his heart as his pupils rapidly dilated. Oh no! The curse is about to act up. Dorian hurriedly reached into his pocket to retrieve a small metal bottle. He opened the lid and gulped it down. Clang! His actions were so hurried that the lid of the metal bottle fell to the ground. Force watched as her teacher's face turned pale. She watched as he clutched his chest, unable to react to what had happened. As a former surgeon, she quickly came to a conclusion and hurriedly said, "Teacher, are you having a heart attack? Do you have any special medicine?" After asking the last question, Force realized that she had been overly anxious and concerned, making her appear a little silly. The bottle that the teacher drank was definitely the special medicine. "Do you need any help?" "I have the recorded a doctor's powers," Force asked when she saw that her teacher had recovered based on his expression. Dorian shook his head, indicating that he was fine. At the same time, he sighed inwardly. "It's because you didn't do as I planned and had directly summoned German Sparrow into this room, causing me to not have time to drink the medicine." Sonia C., the capital of the Rorsted Archipelago, the city of generosity, Bayam. The Blue Avenger docked at the port in the evening. During that period of time, the damage brought to the sea traffic around Sonia Island by the Church of the Lord of Storms had finally attracted the actions of the Faesac Empire's demigods. Many captains had died in the line of duty, and their fleet had suffered a severe blow. Alger Wilson and his crew avoided this attack while hiding in the primitive forest of the island while waiting for an opportunity to attack the port. After the Church of the Lord of Storms and the Lun Naval Army declared their goal for this battle had been achieved, they returned to Pazu Island to rest since it was over. After that, Alger deliberately engaged in battle. He appeared pious, passionate, and fervent. He was praised by the cardinals as a result. This was because he was familiar with the area around the Rorsted Archipelago. Without a doubt, he had been sent here to strengthen the naval forces of the important colony. Of course, in order to avoid conflict with his past identity, he also made preparations for other matters in the future. Alger and his crew arrived in Bayam in the name of recruiting pirates. In this war, many pirates were recruited, effectively making up for the losses of the navies of the various countries, just like the recruitment of mercenaries during the early and mid-stages of the Fourth Epoch. Taking advantage of the fact that there was still some light in the sky, Alger got off the boat and headed straight for Sea King John Cotman's Cathedral of Waves. As a Sequence 5 ocean songster, he had the right to directly meet the Church of the Lord of Storms Cardinal, a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers. As he walked, Alger suddenly saw a familiar face. It was a middle-aged man wearing a formal suit, a bow tie, and glasses. He looked rather refined, but Alger knew very well that he was a believer of sea god Calvetua. He had once been a pirate, and now he was a merchant that did business with both the authorities and the underworld. "Long time no see, Ralph." Alger greeted the illegitimate child that had Lun, Faesac, and Rorsted mixed blood. Ralph was stunned for a moment, as if he couldn't recognize the captain of the Blue Avenger. "Alger? Our captain of the ghost ship?" After a few seconds, he asked in surprise. Alger smiled and said, "Did I change a lot?" Ralph frowned and replied, "Your temperament has changed a lot. It's even more like the ocean and dark clouds before a storm. Quite a keen eye. However, this is an act I'm deliberately showing. After consuming the ocean songster potion, if there wasn't such a change, I wouldn't seem like someone from the Church of the Lord of Storms." Alger sighed and said, "Because there are too many things to worry about. Now, it's all good, I've already been hired by the Church of the Lord of Storms." Ralph narrowed his eyes as a sense of vigilance rose in his heart. He laughed and said, "This is indeed a good thing if there was no war." Alger glanced at the spot where Ralph had just come out and asked, "When did a new school appear here?" He could see at a glance that there were 4-story buildings, a cement field, a garden lawn, and many children happily playing. The children had dark skin, but some of them didn't have bronze skin like the locals. Their hair was only slightly curled, and it wasn't too obvious. Without a doubt, this group consisted of mixed-blood children. Ralph looked back and sighed with a smile. "Didn't you donate money to my charity foundation?" Under God's guidance, I established a few schools in several large cities on the island, specially providing education, 3 meals, and accommodation for these discriminated children. Our childhood was gloomy, and I don't want them to be the same. At the same time Ralph responded, Alger kept staring at the school. When Ralph was done speaking, Alger looked away and said, I thought you would have taken at least half of it. Ralph broke out into laughter. Seems like I left a terrible impression on you. How is it? What opinions do you have about this school? Alger sized him up and said, Do you think I've been to school before? He paused for a moment before saying, Which street is your charity foundation on? I might come to you for something in the future. Thinking that the other party had been hired by the Church of the Lord of Storms, Ralph didn't dare to expose his connection to the resistance. He chuckled and said, It's fine to donate, but you don't have to come for anything else. After giving the location of the charity foundation, Ralph returned home. He went up to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door of a room. Lord Danitz, I have something to report. In the room, a deep and dignified voice replied, Come in. Backland, Sherwood Borough. Dorian, who lived in a rented apartment, walked to the window. As the sun set, the sky gradually darkened. The crimson moon would be full tonight, and the curse of the Abraham family would descend once again. It had been a while since he had shaved his beard. Around his mouth, on both sides of his cheeks and lower jaw, there was a white mustache growing. It appeared out of place with his middle-aged man's appearance. After looking for a while, Dorian bowed his head and recited in Jotun, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. After ending his prayer, he returned to his room and found a sofa to sit down. He waited for the crimson moon to rise and for the period when the spirituality was the strongest to arrive. At that moment, in the ancient palace above the grey fog, Klein had already taken his seat that belonged to the fool. He beckoned for a paper figurine. The paper figurine was surrounded by the power of Sapphira Castle as it passed through Dorian's prayer light and landed on him. During this process, Klein deliberately didn't show any effects, allowing the angel to silently embrace Dorian. He felt that if Mr. Fool were to appear too bombastic, it would scare this ancient family's member, so he chose to keep a low profile. The waiting process was always torturous. From time to time, Dorian would take out his pocket watch, click it open, and take a look. He wanted to know how long more before the full moon possessed its highest spirituality. This was something that could be inferred through the mysticism knowledge. Finally, when it was almost dawn, Dorian instinctively bent down to reduce the pain brought by the curse. However, as time passed, all he heard was complete silence. There were no buzzing ravings. The crimson moonlight passed through the window and shone on Dorian. He looked up in a daze and felt that the surroundings were serene, calm, and indifferent. Nothing abnormal happened. Dorian looked out of the window and saw the crimson moon. It was pure, dignified, gentle, and dreamy, as though it was hanging on his heart. After a moment of silence, Dorian lowered his head and took out his pocket watch. He raised his right hand and rubbed his eyes. He covered his face and didn't loosen his grip for a long time. The white mustache on his face gradually became messy, stained with tears and snot. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1209. Inside the room, the crimson glow was like water that soaked every corner. Dorian slowly lifted his head and looked at the full moon outside the oriel window. He didn't look away for a long time, as if he was admiring a beautiful scenery for the first time. Phew! He let out a breath, stood up, and entered the bathroom. He turned on the tap, held up a mouthful of biting cold water, and splashed it hard on his face. After washing up, Dorian wiped his face with a towel and returned to the living room to sit on the sofa. He lowered his head and muttered piously, "Praise be to Mr. Fool." After completing his prayer, he walked into the study, took out a pen and paper, and wrote to Force. "Please tell Mr. German Sparrow that I have confirmed his promise. I hope he can find a better way to resolve the curse. I will gather the other members of my family to discuss if I should use one of the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts in exchange for the box of the Great Old Ones." Here, let me introduce the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts so that Mr. German Sparrow will have sufficient time to consider which one he wants. One of them is called Scroll of God. It looks like an ordinary oil painting in a brass frame, but the content on it will change at random. When it shows different locations, the wielder can change the surroundings of the target, allowing the corresponding scene to descend. FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. When it shows different figures, the wielder can allow those people to attack their targets with 1 target per figure. When it presents an abstract image that cannot be understood, different real effects will happen, and the only thing we know about the corresponding relationship is a very small portion. When it depicts doors, opening different doors will move one to different places. There's no way to predict where the destination will be. It can be used to exile its target. When it shows the dark underground or deep cosmos, it will be extremely dangerous. It has to be sealed. If no one looks at it or takes in the marvel of the oil painting, then the person inside will come to life. They will reach out their hands from the oil painting and slowly enter the real world. One must pay attention to this when sealing it. Once upon a time, when one of my family's branches were in charge of the Scroll of God, there was a mistake. No one appreciated it for a full minute. And at that moment, it presented an image of an angel revolving around the deity. Then, the deity came alive and walked out of the oil painting. That branch of my family was destroyed just like that. There were only a few members remaining who had lost their minds, while that deity had gone somewhere unknown, but the painting was left behind. We had been worried for quite some time, afraid that the deity would destroy the world. Fortunately, he never appeared again. Perhaps he had already been noticed by the 7 deities and was dealt with. Of course, we can't rule out the possibility that this is a story made up by those who have lost their minds. However, for most of the members to have died overnight, with a small number going mad, that in itself implies enough. The other Grade 0 sealed artifact is called Staff of the Stars. Its appearance is a black cane with embedded gems. While holding onto it, using corresponding scenes in your mind, one that truly exists and is still in existence, the staff will transport you directly to the destination, but you must be careful. The scene depicted must be absolutely correct. Every detail must be accurate. There cannot be any differences with the original. Otherwise, you will never know where your destination is. Similarly, while holding onto the Staff of the Stars, if some beyonder powers or figures appear in your mind, this cane will reenact the corresponding powers and person. The latter will be a single attack. To achieve such an effect, one has to have sufficient understanding of the powers and figures. Otherwise, you have no idea what kind of anomaly will happen. Once, someone used the Staff of the Stars to release a lightning storm, but he ended up turning himself into a frog. Recovery was only possible once the method to remove the curse was found. The Staff of the Stars is sufficiently hard and can be used to attack. A person struck by it will randomly mutate or suffer strange effects. Previously, I used the Staff of the Stars to hit a Beyonder from the Aurora Order. The left side of his body was moved outside a door, and his right side remained where it was. His organ splattered out as a result. The Staff of the Stars will randomly move about. If it isn't properly sealed, it might disappear at some point in time and escape your control. When holding it, one's head has to be empty most of the time. This is because once an image appears, it can trigger the effects I described in the beginning. If there's no one holding onto it, all sorts of abnormalities will happen around the Staff of the Stars. It's hard to predict what will happen. It has to be sealed. Burn upon reading. After writing the letter, Dorian read it several times to make sure that there was no mistake before stuffing it into an envelope and pasting a stamp on it. At that moment, in the ancient palace above the grey fog. Through the prayer point of light, Klein had watched Dorian's entire process of writing the letter. I seem to have forgotten to tell him that he can pass the corresponding information to German Sparrow through Mr. Fool. That's good too. I'll just treat this as a benefit of being a formal member of the Tarot Club. If every believer were to do this, I wouldn't be able to cope if I didn't leave any worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle. Yes, this can also effectively maintain Mr. Fool's prestige. It will ensure that the Abrahams won't dare to belittle Mr. Fool. Klein mumbled before turning his attention onto the two Grade 0 sealed artifacts. He once again confirmed that Grade 0 sealed artifacts had severe negative effects and couldn't be used as common items. Of course, their powers had extremely terrifying and potent effects. They were worthy of the Grade 0. In comparison, the Staff of the Stars is more suitable for me. I can get Miss Justice to hypnotize me in advance so that my subconscious thoughts won't appear in the form of an image or scene. Only by consciously willing it in my mind will I be able to form the outline of a scene. I wonder if the residents of the City of Silver will be able to leave the forsaken land of the gods with the Staff of the Stars in their hands by just outlining the scene of Backlund streets in their minds. But there's no way to hypnotize them before this. They haven't really seen Backlund. Even if they restore the corresponding scene, it's difficult for them to accurately outline the details. Anyway, it's very troublesome, but I can give it a try and choose a volunteer who isn't afraid of death. If I can exchange for the Staff of the Stars, there's no need to rush to shatter it and turn it back into a characteristic. Who knows when it might come in handy? After all, the advancement ritual might not be completed. With the Staff of the Stars, I can deal with the dark demonic wolf and escape the forsaken land of the gods right under the Dark Angel's nose. This will give me a little more confidence. Klein sighed as he made his decision. At this moment, he discovered another truth. That was if some of the members of the Abraham family followed Dorian and switched faiths to Mr. Fool, then even if he returned the box of the Great Old Ones to them, it wouldn't be difficult to borrow it in the future. In other words, out of the 3 Grade 0 sealed artifacts, the Staff of the Stars, the Scroll of God, and the box of the Great Old Ones, he would gain the right to use 2 of them and have ownership over 1. It's still very useful to develop believers. When the time comes, wouldn't the Abraham family become a subordinate faction of the Tarot Club? However, Dorian definitely won't spread the faith of the Fool so quickly unless some members are already on the brink of losing control, without the ability to resist the curse of the next full moon. For some reason, he felt that the power of the Tarot Club was expanding. He thought about it seriously and felt sad that he would have to respond to his believers 24 hours a day in the future. Only by becoming an angel and truly gaining ownership of Sapphira Castle did he dare leave a few worms of spirit behind so as to resolve this problem. If that really doesn't work, I'll get a Rhodes to be my artificial intelligence customer service. Klein rubbed his temples and left the grey fog before returning to the forsaken land of the gods. Late at night, in the waters of the Rorsted archipelago, a huge sea monster quickly swam to its destination. This was the helper that Alger had requested from sea god Calvetua. At the level of an ocean songster, he was still unable to control a creature of such size. In truth, he could totally swim from by him, but that would be too tiring, and he wouldn't be able to resist any accidents. A few seconds later, the sea monster opened its mouth. Alger swam out and approached a beautiful coral thicket. After circling a few obstacles, a dark blue glow suddenly appeared in Alger's eyes. Through this dark blueness, he saw a beautiful coral palace. It was so real, but no one could see it unless there was a specific medium. Alger stared at it for a while before swimming forward. He came to the front of the palace and pushed open the door. The churning water came to a halt as Alger passed through the barrier and landed on the ground thanks to the wind. He looked around and saw that there were murals on both sides. The contents of these murals weren't surprising. The people with elven faces mainly focused on resisting the storm. However, Alger noticed that the ships weren't out at sea, but in the midst of a thick, nearly indestructible blackness. This made Alger think of a phrase, abyss. This is somewhat similar to the abyss as spoken in legends, but it's just a little similar, and there aren't any devils either. They seem to be coming from underground. These murals record the history of the elves, but they don't match the corresponding myths. The world said that each elvish word corresponds to a first-generation elf. As Alger pondered, he walked towards the 9 steps ahead. As he drew closer, he saw 2 thrones and a dark blue crystalline coral. On the coral branches, silver bolts of lightning flashed, illuminating the surroundings. Alger held his breath as he slowed down his pace and went up the stairs to the throne. He extended his right hand solemnly and picked up the coral. With a splashing sound, the seawater outside the palace suddenly churned. As for the coral, under the cover of a dark blueness, it gradually turned illusory and merged into Alger's body. Lightning bolts bloomed one after another like flower petals. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:10. In the forsaken land of the gods, at night, when the frequency of lightning was very low, a few humanoid creatures cautiously approached a meatball with 6 legs and more than 10 eyes. They were wrapped in animal skins or clothes with materials that couldn't be identified. With the help of a few lanterns, they passed through the endless darkness with heavy expressions. On their faces, there were about 10 to 20 tumors. Some of their eyes were nearly squeezed together, while others didn't have a nose, with only a black hole in that place. After a series of intense battles, they managed to successfully finish off the monster and split into 2 groups. One group guarded the surroundings, and another group reaped the spoils of war. During this process, the man with many meat tumors on his face dissected the monster's corpse. When he was searching for edible parts, he suddenly stopped. "Adal, what's the matter?" the woman without a nose asked curiously. The man named Adal slowly retracted his right hand and revealed an item he had found from the monster. It was a stone-carved amulet covered with marks of corrosion. "This is..." The man, whose eyes were nearly squeezed together, seemed to understand the reason and hesitated to finish his sentence. Adal surveyed the area and said, "Shin, Russ, this was given to my father when I was young. On the day I became an adult, he felt that he could no longer control himself. He chose to leave the city and enter the depths of the darkness." When Shin and Russ heard that, they fell silent for a moment. They could understand Adal's feelings. This was a common occurrence in Moon City. As there was no safe edible food, they could only pick the mutated plant fruits and collect the flesh of monsters to maintain their survival. This resulted in the accumulation of toxins and madness in the body. After a decline in their physical conditions, they would either die quickly or gradually lose control. In order to not cause any damage to the surroundings and city, those who were part of the latter would often arrange everything after sensing that their conditions weren't right. With a torch and a small amount of food, they would leave the defensive perimeter and wander into the eternal darkness alone, never to return. The residents of Moon City could imagine what would happen to them. They would either be killed by monsters or become monsters. There was no other possibility. After 7 to 8 seconds of silence, the woman without a nose hesitantly said, "Perhaps, this is the monster that killed your father. It has a belt made of animal skin wrapped around it." Adal's voice gradually lowered. He picked up the dagger made of bone and forcefully inserted it, cutting out a relatively normal piece of flesh. Amidst the silence, the members of the hunting team completed their harvest skillfully until Russ, whose eyes were nearly squeezed together, suddenly said in a deep voice, "There are more and more deformities amongst the newborn." The price of accumulating toxins and madness for generations wasn't as simple as reducing their average life expectancy. The people who still had normal physical conditions were gradually experiencing some mutations, just like Adal, who had many tumors on his face. Similarly, the toxins and madness could also be passed down to their descendants, causing mutations to appear. Russ and Shin from the hunting team were examples. Their lives would be even shorter, making it easier for them to lose control and mutate. The more abnormalities there were, the more obvious the implications were. The hunting teams present knew very well that it might not take more than 2 to 3 generations before the residents of Moon City would lose control before they fully grew up or have children. When that happened, even if there was no external attack, Moon City would quickly be destroyed, leaving behind only stone buildings and murals to prove their existence. I hope the High Priest and the others can find a new direction. Adal stood up with a lantern in hand as he answered weakly. In the past 2 to 3,000 years, it wasn't as if Moon City hadn't found a way to escape their current predicament. They had sent out teams of exploration teams that headed deep into the darkness. Some returned after suffering serious setbacks, with nothing to show for their efforts. Some disappeared into the boundless darkness, and nothing was heard from them ever again. In addition, at a distance away, to the east of Moon City, was a grayish-white fog that blotted out the sky and land. They were like invisible barriers that not only blocked one's vision, but also prevented any living beings from passing through. The residents of Moon City once believed that this was a place of hope. They believed that the area covered by the grayish-white fog was a normal country. They believed that the other side of the grey fog was a land that wasn't cursed. They attempted to enter the grayish-white fog again and again, but all their attempts failed. They had dug a long passageway, hoping to pass through the invisible barrier by going underground. However, the region deep underground was also covered in grayish-white fog. They tried ways to obtain the ability of flight before attempting to cross the barrier at high altitudes, but they didn't manage to see the top of the grayish-white fog before they were struck by lightning. They mobilized the powers of all the demigods and sealed artifacts, attacking the target again and again. Over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years, the cumulative attacks they performed failed to disperse the invisible barrier at all. Upon hearing Captain Adal's words, the members of the hunting team felt hopeless and sad. It was as though they were sliding down the edge of the abyss, but were unable to save themselves. The deformed ones were people who found it difficult to control their emotions. At that moment, they more or less felt like they were suppressing something in their hearts, eager to unleash it. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/lb-in.com. In Moon City, a deformed person wasn't allowed to become a Beyonder or join the hunting teams 200 to 300 years ago. They could only do harvesting work. However, as their manpower dwindled, the High Priest and the rest of the higher-ups relaxed the restrictions. Let's go. This bit of food isn't enough. Adal looked around, carrying lanterns as he walked deeper into the darkness. They didn't take the risk of extinguishing the fire, causing monsters to surge out in the darkness, as they might not be able to deal with them. In such a quiet and suffocating environment, the members of the Moon City's hunting team couldn't help but have the feeling that they were enveloped in an endless darkness. It was as though it was impossible to find hope regarding the present situation of Moon City, and the amount of time the lanterns in their hands could burn was decreasing. When the last trace of light dissipated, they would be silently devoured by the darkness. As they walked, a faint yellow light suddenly appeared in Adal's eyes. It was a glow that didn't belong to the hunting team. This bit of light immediately shone into the eyes of all the members of the hunting team, filling their pupils. Adal, Shin, Russ, and company couldn't help but widen their eyes as they felt a deep sense of shock. During their lifetime, there had never been any fires that came from external sources in the history of Moon City after the cataclysm. Indeed, many monsters possessed the powers of fire or the sun domain, but before attacking, they were all hidden in the darkness without revealing any hint of light. And now, a fiery glow appeared deep in the darkness. Adal, Shin, and Russ trembled slightly as they thought for a long time but couldn't think of an answer. They quickly recalled the hunting arrangements and confirmed that it was impossible for residents of Moon City to be nearby. Since the fiery glow didn't belong to Moon City, where did it come from? The entire hunting team slowed down. They were shocked, surprised, curious, fearful, worried, and terrified. They had also discovered some destroyed cities and knew that any abnormalities in the darkness could be fatal. Be alert! Adal finally snapped out of his daze and gave the order. The hunting team immediately took up a battle formation, waiting for the faint yellow light to approach. Time seemed to freeze at this moment. Every second was slow. Finally, after the fiery glow grew bigger, a figure appeared. A figure? There's only one person. The members of the Moon City hunting team held their breaths. It seemed like, maybe, perhaps, they might have a chance of seeing an outsider. 2,000 to 3,000 years had passed, and finally, someone else had stepped foot on this land. They were not the only ones left in this abandoned world. As for who could travel through endless darkness and reach this place, Adal and company lacked experience, so they had no way of guessing. As the fiery glow became bigger and more obvious, the hunting team members gradually saw the figure. It was a slim young man. He had black hair and brown eyes, and his expression was cold. He was neither a deformed person nor had he any abnormal changes. He wore a strange hat and strange clothes. He held a lantern made of special materials as he walked over from the darkness. The light of his lantern was even brighter than the combined light of the hunting team. It made the surrounding darkness fade rapidly. It didn't take long before the light shone on the bodies of the likes of Adal, Shin, and Russ. The figure stopped and looked at the Moon City hunting team. He asked in a low voice, "Where are you from?" He spoke Jotun. His eyes are clear, and he can communicate. Adal opened his mouth, stopping his subconscious urge to reply. He asked in return, "Who are you?" The figure with the glass lantern replied calmly, "German Sparrow." After half a year of traveling and overcoming one difficult obstacle after another, Klein's spiritual intuition finally told him that he was finally reaching his destination. And he had also encountered the first batch of living people in his trip across the forsaken land of the gods. "Where did you come from?" Adal kept his guard up and pressed. Klein swept his gaze across their faces and said without a change in tone, "I came from the City of Silver. And also from a land beyond the Cursed Lands." Upon hearing this answer, all the members of the hunting team were in a daze. They suspected whether they were expecting too much, causing them to hallucinate. In the autumn of 1351, Backlund, in the midst of the war. Ever since Fanapotter declared war on Lun, the war that had been going on for some time had finally lost its balance. Lun and its allies Lenberg, Mason, and Sigga had lost a large amount of territory, leaving only the last few lines of defense that they defended with great difficulty. They were on the brink of being overrun. When she saw the long line of people at the food distribution center through the carriage window, Audrey slowly retracted her gaze and said to her personal maidservant, "Annie, turn toward St. Samuel Cathedral." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:11. As the carriage drove slowly along the road, Audrey's gaze subconsciously looked out the window. Many passers-by stood by the roadside, staring at the horse that was pulling the carriage. Their eyes seemed to be emitting a greedy glint as they, the lucky ones, successfully collected their food. They ran through the street surreptitiously and headed for home. A team of policemen in black and white checkered uniforms were patrolling the streets. They had revolvers by their waists and batons in their hands, means to deter anyone from wanting to take risks. "Recently, we don't even dare to go on the streets alone," the personal maidservant, Annie, whispered to her. Audrey nodded slightly but didn't respond. After a while, the carriage arrived at Felt Street and stopped at the square in front of St. Samuel Cathedral. The flock of pigeons that were usually here was nowhere to be seen. The Lun Charity Bursary Foundation, as well as the subsequent establishment of the Lun Poverty Relief Foundation and the Lun Medical Charity Foundation, had all moved from 22 Felt Street to a few small rooms in the cathedral. This was because the buildings that they were originally housed in had collapsed due to the previous airstrike. To the staff of these three foundations, it was a harrowing memory. If they hadn't left 22 Felt Street in advance due to different reasons, they would have long been killed. After alighting from the carriage and walking through the main door, Audrey saw a black-haired, brown-eyed girl with a rather thin face approach. Before the other party could speak, she said, "Melissa, is there any more food that can be distributed?" Melissa shook her head solemnly. "Even those injured soldiers who we provided relief for can't receive enough food." Audrey's green eyes dimmed. She didn't show her helplessness or weakness as she nodded slightly. "I will think of a way." "From the City of Silver?" "From a land beyond the Cursed Lands." German Sparrow's words echoed in the ears of the Moon City hunting team members Adal, Shin, and Russ. It made them feel like they were in a dream, unable to regain their senses for a long time. Just as Adal gradually regained his senses and was thinking about what to say when Shin, who was born without a nose, inundated Klein with a series of questions. "Where is the City of Silver? What does it look like? How far is it from here? How many normal people are there outside the cursed area?" Klein glanced at her and replied in an emotionless voice, "The City of Silver is located on the other side of the Cursed Lands. They discovered a type of plant that can be eaten normally called black-faced grass. This has allowed them to maintain their kind stability and effectively explore the depths of the darkness in a bid to find a way to leave. They recently found some mushrooms. These mushrooms can use monsters as nutrients, forming all kinds of fruits that do not contain toxins and madness. The City of Silver has gone one step further in escaping the madness. Once the newborns become adults, they wouldn't easily lose control even at old age. These words made Adal, Shin, and company feel lost, as though their own persistent efforts had no meaning. The City of Silver described by German Sparrow was the most beautiful scene they could imagine, yet it was something so easily possessed by others. Are there any deformed newborns? Shin asked in a dreamy tone. Klein shook his head. Almost none. Will their parents walk into the depths of the darkness by themselves when their physical condition deteriorates? No, when they become old? Adal subconsciously pressed. Wearing a black trench coat, a top hat, and holding a lantern, Klein replied, no. Because they are burdened with the curse of killing their own kin. If a life cannot be ended by the hands of a blood relative, they will turn into a terrifying evil spirit or monster. The members of the hunting team in Moon City finally found a sense of reality. Their hearts felt like they were slowly rising in warm water as bubbles slowly emerged. These bubbles were weak, empty, and easily pricked. There was nothing inside, but they shimmered with something called hope and light. Russ, whose eyes were nearly squeezed together, couldn't help but repeat the question. How many normal people are there outside the cursed area? Klein looked at them with a complicated expression. They are basically normal. They do not need to be constantly worried about monsters attacking them. They don't have to be afraid of being in the darkness. They don't go crazy after growing old. They aren't burdened by all kinds of curses. They see sunlight every day when they wake up, with sufficiently normal food. Every night, the crimson moon rises. However, all of this is being destroyed now. Klein silently added in his heart. This time, Adal, Shin, and Russ were somewhat at a loss. This was because they found German Sparrow's description as something imaginable, but also seemingly unimaginable. It was just like when they were reading the few ancient books remaining. They could get the spirit of the matter, but found it hard to truly understand certain contexts. They had no idea what the sun and what the crimson moon were. However, to have normal food every day without the burden of various curses, the worry of monster attacks or darkness, and the lack of going crazy in old age was a beautiful dream they yearned for day and night. There's such a place in this world? Is this what heaven, as recorded in the ancient books, is? Was this land really cursed? The members of the Moon City hunting team fell silent once again. One of them opened their mouth but was at a loss as to what to ask. Someone wanted to bring German Sparrow back to Moon City and inform the High Priest of the news, wanting to inform everyone, but he was afraid of attracting danger. During this process, they didn't let down their guard or vigilance. Klein wasn't the least bit surprised with their attitude. Instead, he felt that this was the reaction a civilization that could last to this day in the forsaken land of the gods ought to have. With the lantern in hand, he took a step to the left, attempting to walk around the humans who were dressed in strange materials or animal skins, and he continued heading east. Regardless of what story these people had, whether it was worth helping them in passing, he planned to wait until he began his investigations before listening and considering things. This was because his spiritual intuition told him that his destination wasn't far, and that the legendary West Continent was just 2 to 3 hours away on foot. The moment he took a step forward, Adal and company immediately bent their backs, bracing themselves to defend an attack. However, they didn't manage to see German Sparrow approach them. They watched as he walked more than 10 meters to the left and continued heading forward. Seeing this young man dressed in strange black clothes and a strange black hat, with a strange and transparent lantern gradually distancing himself from them, the dim yellow light grew weaker and weaker. Adal's face, which was covered in tumors, changed. He shouted loudly, "Who exactly are you?" Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Klein didn't turn around. Instead, he held a lantern that emitted a faint yellow light and walked deeper into the darkness. He said in a regular tone, "A missionary." A person to spread my lord's brilliance. Adal, Shin, and company looked at each other, their expressions filled with confusion. They hesitated for a long while, but when there was only a small trace of the dim yellow light left, they instinctively took a step forward and followed behind Klein. They didn't dare to approach him, nor did they want to have him leave their sight. They carried the food they had procured, as though they were monitoring and chasing him in a defensive manner. As for Klein, he walked at an adequate speed, not waiting for them or attempting to shake them off. Just like that, both sides walked in silence under the sparse lightning. At some point in time, Russ and another hunting team had left the main group. They held the animal hide lantern and the food they had obtained and turned around, silently disappearing into the endless darkness. Seconds changed to minutes before Klein finally stopped. Using the lightning that streaked across the sky, he saw a grayish-white fog a few hundred meters away. The mist was connected to the land and extended all the way into the sky, as though it didn't have an apex. At the same time, the fog extended to the two sides without any end. Klein looked at it intently for a long time. Even though there were partitions of darkness, he slowly raised his head. After the second bolt of lightning calmed down, he looked away. Behind the fog or inside it is the disappeared western continent. As he thought with a heavy heart, he couldn't help but slow down his breathing. He carried the lantern and continued forward until the dim yellow light emitted a solidified mist. There was no need for him to make any other attempts. From his intuition as a seer, he could tell that the grayish-white fog was an invisible barrier that couldn't be passed through by conventional means. He thought for a moment and stretched out his right hand to scratch at the darkness in front of him again and again. After doing it 4 to 5 consecutive times, Klein pulled out a black cane with many gems embedded in it. This was the Staff of the Stars, a terrifying sealed artifact known as 0 to 62 that had been swapped using the box of the Great Old Ones. Of course, all he did was summon the historical projection of the Staff of the Stars. This way, even if there were unnecessary scenes that appeared in his mind, he could use the removal of the historical void projection to stop any corresponding dangers that appeared in a timely manner. To a scholar of yore, this was the best way to regularly use a Grade 0 sealed artifact. However, this limited the effects and was something that couldn't exceed 3 minutes at the moment. Furthermore, there was a certain difference with the original version when it came to their effects. Using a marionette to hold the Staff of the Stars wasn't the best way to avoid any negative effects. This was because a marionette needed to be controlled, and any control had a high chance of transmitting scenes. Of course, if he engaged in a battle he was prepared for, Klein wouldn't have done so. This was because it would occupy one of his 3 precious summoning spots. Furthermore, although the Staff of the Stars belonged to him, it was only in a state of forced ownership, and it remained in a sealed state. Furthermore, the Grade 0 sealed artifact had a rather high level. It was impossible for Klein to successfully summon it at once, so it usually took him 3 to 6 attempts. In a fierce battle, it would require plenty of chances, nothing simple. And it was precisely because of this that when he was prepared to perform, he would hypnotize himself in advance. By using the Staff of the Stars in a special state, he would preserve the ability to summon historical void images like Miss Messenger, Mr. Azik, Moriona, Will or Septin, and other familiar angels. Holding the black staff that was embedded with various gems, a scene of the door slowly opening appeared in Klein's mind. The gems on the staff flashed with a faint glow as the grayish-white fog quickly outlined a door that wasn't sufficiently real. The door opened silently, and behind it was still a grey fog. Door opening doesn't work. Although he wasn't surprised by the outcome, he was still a little disappointed. He thought for a moment and decided to switch tactics. However, just as he was thinking about it, the Staff of the Stars automatically activated as the corresponding scene appeared. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:12. Just now, as Klein was thinking of a solution, an image naturally came to mind. The clouds in the 2 mountains began to boil rapidly as they spread out to the left and right, revealing a crack whose bottom couldn't be seen. The orange-red rays of the sunset filled it and formed a corporeal path. This was a scene created when Blasphemer Amon entered the projection of the Giant King's court. And just as he felt that he didn't know enough about the corresponding powers and planned on switching to another method. The red, green, blue, and transparent gems on the staff of the stars had already begun to emit a faint glow as they automatically activated. The solidified grayish-white fog was similarly boiling, but it wasn't that intense. They were churning backward as they parted, but the area right in front of him remained an endless grayish-white mass. There was no end to it. Klein sighed in his heart. As he focused on controlling his thoughts, he made other attempts. In the past 3 minutes, he had tried hard at least 10 times. 7 times were of his own will, while 3 times were him venting out, but he was ultimately unable to open the invisible barrier. Indeed, normal methods don't work. With a flick of his wrist, he allowed the historical projection of 0 to 62, which was close to its limit, to disappear from the real world. He stared at the silent grayish-white fog and didn't move for about a minute. It was as if he had turned into a statue. Finally, Klein closed his eyes and looked away. Holding the lantern in his hand, he walked towards the nearby humans who were watching. He didn't plan on making blind attempts because there was a high chance that he wouldn't succeed. He planned on asking the people who had stood guard in the vicinity for 2,000 to 3,000 years. It was obvious that these ancient survivors had explored the grayish-white fog. He wanted to see if he could find inspiration from their years of experience. Based on Klein's assumption, the humans would definitely react excessively towards him, so he had already prepared the corresponding powers to allow them to speak to him calmly. However, when he looked at the light of dusk on both sides of the lantern, he realized that the ugly or deformed humans were staring at him with their mouths agape. They looked confused and shocked, as if they had temporarily lost their ability to think. Klein frowned slightly. In the darkness, he walked unhurriedly to the ancient survivors and stopped about 2 to 3 meters away. "What do you know about this fog?" Klein asked in Jotun with a deep voice. The language that could stir the powers of nature didn't have any differences because of geography. There was only a slight difference in the accent, but it wasn't much. If the original version was modified, there was a chance its effects in ritualistic magic would be lost. It was only when German Sparrow raised the question that Adal seemed to snap out of his daze. His lips quivered as he answered in an ambiguous tone, We have never caused the fog to change before." Just now, German Sparrow had caused the fog to boil like water and part to the sides. This scene had really frightened them, as though they were witnessing a miracle. The 2,000 to 3,000 years of hard work from numerous generations of Moon City inhabitants were inferior to a person holding a staff with an attempt that didn't last more than 200 heartbeats. This was also the main reason why they had given up on resisting when German Sparrow approached them. They instinctively believed that, no matter how they avoided him, it would be to no avail. After 2 seconds of silence, Klein continued asking, "Do you have any corresponding records?" At this moment, Adal understood what German Sparrow meant. He hesitated for a moment and slowly nodded. "Yes." However, only the high priest and the others would frequently look through it. Wearing a black trench coat and half-top hat, Klein thought for a moment and suddenly reached out to pull out an item from the void. It was a cross covered in bronze, with several sharp spikes protruding out from it. It was the historical image of the ancient sun god's unshadowed crucifix. With the cross in hand, Klein raised it a little higher and aimed it at the ancient survivors. Pure, bright, and warm light bloomed, dispersing the darkness around them and illuminating them. Their combat experience made them instinctively attempt to defend themselves, but their action stopped midway through the process. The brightness and warmth wasn't something a bonfire could compare with. This made the remaining members of the Moon City hunting team recall the deities described by the ancient books and the high priest. They were deities who emitted boundless light and brought boundless warmth. Under the illumination of the bright, pure light, a distorted, struggling illusionary black gas that seemed to have a life of its own began to boil from the bodies of Adal, Shin, and company, quickly rising and dissipating. The members of the Moon City hunting team felt their bodies become more relaxed, and the pressure within their souls disappeared. After purging the cumulative corruption and ailments of their bodies, Klein shook his wrist slightly, causing the unshadowed crucifix to disappear in front of him. Right on the heels of that, he grabbed another cane that looked an ordinary wooden color. This was the former City of Silver's sealed artifact, Life's Cane. Although he had already sacrificed it to the Evernight goddess, as long as it was once owned by a scholar of yore, it would only accompany them in a different way. With Life's Cane in hand, Klein took a few steps forward and used the end of the cane to tap the leader of Moon City's hunting team. The experience from before made Adal unable to dodge. The tumors on his face began to crack as pus flowed, faded, and disappeared. In the end, there wasn't even a single scar left. From the looks of his team members, Adal knew that he had undergone a change. He hesitantly raised his right hand and touched his face. From top to bottom and back up again, he kept repeating it. During this process, he realized that he was in an unprecedented healthy state, one that was better than when he first became an adult. Klein didn't look at him. He took a step diagonally and used Life's Cane to treat the rest of the ancient survivors. With Adal as an example, Shin and the others were on their guard and alert as they accepted contact with the cane, and they felt that they had obtained a new lease of life. Amongst them, the two deformed beings who were easily emotional couldn't help but tear up. Unfortunately, I can't treat natural defects. Mental illnesses can be treated, but some crazy tendencies can't be treated. Klein retracted his right hand and let the historical projection of Life's Cane disappear. He walked to his original spot and turned around. He looked at the ancient survivors and said, "I'm not here to destroy, but to spread the radiance of my Lord, bringing light and warmth. Go back and tell your leader that I'm here. If he's willing, he can come over." He didn't attempt to find out where the gathering point of these ancient survivors was, nor did he plan on going there directly. This would trigger the strongest form of resistance and vigilance. Hence, giving them the choice was the most suitable solution. At that moment, Adal, Shin, and the others were already shocked by German Sparrow's constant pulling out of mystical items. They felt that they were walking into a miracle and had already been cleansed by the divine light, allowing their physical condition to recover to its optimum state. It even exceeded their peak. "All right." A few seconds later, Adal responded. The source of this content N/O/V/Bell by N. Just as they turned around and prepared to return to Moon City, flames lit up from the depths of the darkness as they rapidly approached. The leader was an old man wearing a dark brown beast hide. His hair was grey and unkempt, and his face was full of real cracks. "High Priest?" After recognizing the other party, Shin blurted out. It was none other than Moon City's High Priest, Nim. Behind Nim followed Russ and the other members of the hunting team who had returned to the city ahead of time, as well as several other high-sequence beyonders. Nim nodded at Adal, Shin, and the rest before walking to the front of the group. Looking at the man who claimed to be a missionary, German Sparrow, he crossed his arms and bowed. "Honorable guest, I am Moon City's High Priest, Nim. Moon City once belonged to vampires, but that civilization had been destroyed in ancient times. Afterwards, we accepted the orders of the great sun god, the Lord who created everything, and we moved here to watch the greyish-white fog and make the corresponding attempts. That continued on even though the land was cursed and the Lord didn't respond to us. To date, 3,722 years have passed." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12-13. 3,722 years. Indeed, they were sent here when the ancient sun god was still alive. With the City of Silver's continued survival in the darkness for more than 2,000 years as a reference, Klein easily confirmed the words of Moon City's High Priest. He nodded slightly and asked, "Are you guarding this fog to prevent any anomalies from happening to it?" FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. The High Priest of Moon City, who was wrapped in dark brown beast hide, Nim, shook his head. "The revelation that the Lord gave us was to guard the area all day. We needed to know if anyone walks out of the fog." Walks out of the fog. The ancient sun god had a premonition that a person would walk out of this fog. If the other side of the fog is really the Western continent, does this mean that there might still be life and civilization in it? When Klein heard this, an indescribable palpitation struck his heart, but he deeply realized a certain reality. Amorn's father, the second creator, was actually unable to open this grayish-white fog, and even needed to send people here to watch over it. Is there a specific method needed to pass through this invisible barrier? Mr. Hanged Man mentioned before that the Queen of Calamity, Kohainam, said that an incantation or command might be needed. Also, the premise is that the Western continent has already resurfaced. As Klein looked at the High Priest, with deep lines on his face, he said without batting an eyelid, "I believe they have already introduced me to you. I'm a missionary. I have come to this land to spread the light of the Lord." The High Priest of Moon City, Nim, maintained his composure and used his grey eyes that were the same color as his long hair to look at Klein. "Your Excellency, which existence do you believe in?" Klein instinctively wanted to answer directly, but considering his identity as a missionary that he had set for himself previously, he held back his shame. With the ability of a clown, he controlled his facial muscles and revealed a slightly fanatical expression. "Please permit me to introduce you to my lord, the savior of this land, the great Mr. Fool." The Fool? Moon City's High Priest, Nim, and the others didn't expect to hear such a word. For a moment, they found it strange, but for some reason, they felt that there was an infinite philosophy hidden within. Finally, their attention was focused on the description. The savior of this land. Nim couldn't help but turn his head to look at Adal and the rest, observing their radiant faces. As a sequence for demigod, he knew very well that this was a result of the cleansing of the toxin and corruption accumulated within their bodies. Furthermore, the members of the hunting team had also been given excellent treatment. If he hadn't seen this group of young people grow up and remembered how they looked before the changes, he definitely wouldn't dare to confirm that they were residents of Moon City. Seeing the High Priest look over, Adal immediately said excitedly, "His Excellency Sparrow prayed for a deity's blessing to save us. Yes, we saw light. We felt warmth." Shin, who was without a nose, added. After the catharsis, she had unknowingly developed a certain belief towards the Lord that German Sparrow mentioned. Compared to the Creator who had never responded to prayers and ignored the suffering that Moon City faced, this existence was more like a deity. Russ and another member of the hunting team that went back to Moon City to inform the High Priest looked covetously at their former companions. They were both envious and had a yearning for the new life they had obtained. The High Priest, Nim, retracted his gaze and looked at German Sparrow, who was wearing strange clothes and a strange hat. "Is the great Mr. Fool a deity in this world now, from outside this cursed land?" Klein nodded solemnly and slowly. "Yes." "Then, what about the great sun god who created everything?" Nim hesitated for a moment before asking the question he desired answers to the most. Klein changed his tone to that of a charlatan and said, "The kings betrayed that existence. Blood, anger, foulness, and shadows began to flow across this land, triggering a huge calamity." Nim's pupils dilated slightly, as if he wanted to absorb more light to see the world in front of him. With great difficulty, he tried his best to suppress something and asked, "Are you saying that the Lord perished because of this?" Not only did he perish, but his flesh and blood were also eaten by the traitors. This piece of land was cursed as a result. Taking advantage of the fact that he was in the forsaken land of the gods, Klein boldly said this. He didn't deliberately distinguish the Amorn brothers from the other 6 kings of angels. He planned on making the residents of Moon City believe that all the kings of angels were traitors. This way, they wouldn't be fooled by Amorn in the future. Over the past half a year of traveling and the various experiments he undertook, he was convinced that the forsaken land of the gods really was sealed. Or rather, it was isolated from the outside world. The only point of contact was either the exit of the giant king's court or something at the level of Sapphira Castle. Therefore, using the staff of the stars here allowed him to move within the confines of the cursed land. He was unable to head to the scenes in the outside world as outlined in his mind. In addition, the box of the Great Old Ones was even suppressed and isolated for its historical projection. The moment the summoning succeeded, the projection would immediately be devoured by the environment. It was completely useless. This made him suspect that even the third level of the box of the Great Old Ones was a little dangerous for true deities such as the true Creator. Upon hearing German Sparrow's words, the body of the High Priest of Moon City, Nim, trembled slightly as his pockmarked face instantly turned ashen. The faces of the Beyonders behind him changed as well. It was as if they had suffered an extremely serious blow. One even showed signs of losing control. Seeing this, Klein reached out his hand again and pulled out Life's cane from the void, allowing it to fly through the air and accurately tap the target. The signs of the Beyonders losing control immediately vanished. His forehead was covered in sweat as if he had just overcome a major illness. Following the removal of the historical projection, Life's cane quickly faded away. As for the Beyonders of Moon City, they finally managed to break free from the grievous news. Some of them were filled with suspicion and disbelief, and others were whimpering softly. Some looked at German Sparrow with a lost look, as though he was their final hope. At some point in time, Nim's eyes had already closed. 2 or 3 seconds later, he opened them again and looked at German Sparrow. "What else do you have to ask?" In less than a minute, he looked like he had aged considerably. His body was beginning to show signs of decay and depression. However, it wasn't completely without hope. It was as if the trees were rotting away, but they were beginning to give birth to new lives. Klein half turned and pointed at the coagulated grey fog with the lantern in his hand. "Since when did you begin attempting to open this screen? What did you achieve?" Nim said frankly, "In the beginning, it was the Lord's revelation. While he wanted us to watch over it, he also wanted us to think of a way to pass through the fog. After the land was cursed, we used this to mainly guide us so as to seek hope. However, we ultimately didn't achieve anything concrete. No matter what method we used, the solidified mist didn't react." Upon saying that, he hesitated and said, "It's not that there's no reaction, but it wasn't the reaction we wanted." Klein instantly saw hope and maintained his normal speaking pace as he asked, "What was the reaction?" Seeing that the High Priest was somewhat hesitant and not answering immediately, Shin took the initiative to say, "High Priest, His Excellency Sparrow has already parted a portion of the fog, a depth deeper than what we managed over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years. Nim couldn't help but look deeply at German Sparrow before saying, "More than 1,730 years ago, the High Priest back then was inspired by the cruel fact that Moon City had failed to achieve anything in the past 2,000 years. He felt that we couldn't treat this fog as a seal that needed to be broken through. Instead, it was to be treated as a great existence. He designed the honorific name, prayer stanza, and the corresponding symbols for this fog. He held repeated rituals here, attempting communication and praying. This is a train of thought that no normal person would have thought of. I didn't think of it just now. Indeed, after all these years, there must have been many people with strange ideas in Moon City. 3,000 years of time isn't for nothing." Klein sighed inwardly as he nodded slightly. "Was there any feedback after that?" With a nasal grunt as confirmation, Nim replied, "There was at one point when the High Priest changed the first sentence of the honorific name to the eternally imperturbable fog. Then, during the subsequent ritual, he vaguely heard a series of voices coming from deep within the fog. Unfortunately, he couldn't hear it clearly no matter how hard he tried, making it impossible to interpret it. From then on, the rituals we held were uncountable. We realized that a response wasn't always guaranteed. Even if there was a response, it might not be a timely one. We needed to wait patiently." As the thoughts raced through his mind, Klein asked, "How many times does it roughly take to succeed?" "There are no patterns. Sometimes, we succeed at once. Sometimes, we might not receive any feedback after a month," Nim said with a sigh. "We have made many alterations, but they were all useless." "Did you hear what those voices said afterward?" Klein asked. "No, maybe our sequence isn't high enough or we are still lacking in strength." Nim shook his head. "If that's the reason, I can give it a try." After hesitating for a few seconds, he politely asked, "May you hold the correct ritual again? I would like to hear those voices." This kind of politeness was something Nim couldn't refuse, nor did he dare to refuse. he hesitated for a moment and said, "Sure, but many of the materials are in Moon City. You need to wait for some time." After some thought, Klein asked, "Have you used those materials before?" "Yes," Nimue answered in confusion. Klein nodded indifferently. "Let's just hold it now. Tell me, when was the last time you used those materials and where they were nearby?" Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:14. After hearing the high priest's reply, Klein held his lantern and walked 20 to 30 steps to the right, parallel to the grayish-white fog. Then, he half closed his eyes as though he was sensing something. This made the Moon City beyond us behind him not dare to make a sound, afraid of disturbing the oracle. After 4 to 5 seconds, Klein stretched out his right hand and slowly grabbed the air ahead. An altar made of stone dropped into the real world. On it were 3 candles made of oil and 7 to 8 spiritual materials. As a sequence for demigod, Nim was taken aback. He found it difficult to believe his eyes. Discover new chapters at novelbin.com. Previously, he had seen German Sparrow take out his cane to treat his companion. He had only believed that German Sparrow possessed the powers of space or had received the favor of Mr. Fool. But now, his judgment had been completely overturned. This was because he found the altar, the few candles, and the spiritual materials very familiar. They were all used by him once. He actually managed to create something that I've used before? Is this a power that comes from history, a power that comes from time? Nim recalled the content of the remnant tomes in Moon City and his understanding of demigods as he came to a preliminary guess. At that moment, Klein turned around and looked at the high priest. "You may begin." Nim quietly drew a deep breath. Under the watchful eyes of the likes of the Adal, Shin, and Russ, he walked to the altar and created a wall of spirituality. After taking a look at the symbols, labels, and patterns engraved on the altar and confirming that there were no problems, he followed the process that had been engraved into his memories, and he began the ritual with great familiarity. In the end, he bowed his head and chanted in a low voice, "The eternally imperturbable fog. A barrier frozen in space-time. The existence that contains everything." Before the prayer ended, Klein had already placed his attention on the grayish-white fog, hoping to hear sounds coming from deep within. For this, he had secretly controlled the large number of monster marionettes that walked in the surrounding darkness to separate. He spaced them out at a certain distance, hoping that he wouldn't miss any suspicious traces. However, he didn't notice anything unusual until the ritual was completed. After waiting for a while more, Klein cast his gaze at the high priest of Moon City, Nim, and said calmly, "One more time." Backland, Empress Borough, in the Hall family's study. After receiving permission, Audrey pushed open the door and walked in. Her father, Earl Hall, and her brother, Hibbert, were discussing some matters. "Oh, baby, you don't look too well?" Earl Hall cast his gaze towards the door. Audrey didn't act as she forced a smile and said, "There's a huge lack of food at the Poverty Relief Foundation. I would like to collect more. I visited many nobles today, but they told me that there's no more food left. It's the same even if I offered to buy it with gold pounds." When these words were said, the nobles were either in a parlor or at a spot specially used for high tea. In front of them were high-quality black tea and many exquisite desserts. From time to time, they would invite Audrey to evaluate their dessert chef's culinary skills. Their servants had rosy cheeks, and they took very light footsteps. They didn't make a sound to prevent disturbing their guests. The current situation. Earl Hall sighed when he heard that. Audrey thought for a moment and said seriously, "Father, I remember that there should be quite a lot of food at home. Can I buy some of that with money?" "Audrey, you've already done too much. There's no need for you to do more," Hibbert Hall said with a frown. As for Audrey, she only looked at her father and didn't respond to her elder brother's words. Earl Hall's expression that had relaxed after seeing his daughter became serious again. "Audrey, the prerequisite for charity is not to affect your and your family's life. This is a principle I wish for you to remember." Audrey, who was wearing a long, golden white dress, relaxed her eyebrows and said sincerely, "Father, the amount of food we have stored at home is enough to last everyone in this house for an entire year, or even more. Besides, there's also a lot of food over in East Chester County." As Winter County hadn't completely fallen, the Faysac army that had invaded Mid-Seashire didn't attack East Chester County. As for the Faysac, Intis, and Fainapotter fleet, they were suppressed by the few ironclad warship fleets of Lun. They could only barely deal with the situation and protect the supply line at sea. Seeing his daughter's emerald green eyes for a few seconds, he suddenly sighed and smiled. "Audrey, you have really grown up. You have your own ideas and pretty commendable determination. However, we don't know how long this war will last. We don't know what the outcome will be. We have to leave a lot of food to deal with this. I can accept us having 2 less delicacies for every meal to help those who are in trouble, but I don't want my dining table to become like what the newspaper says about the middle class. This will completely make us lose our dignity as nobles. This is something that we abide with every generation. Do you understand what I mean? I was just making an analogy. The essence of this is that I value the continuation and the future of the family line more. I value our status and standing. Only when it doesn't affect them will I express my love and kindness. Audrey, what I said may be cruel, but you have already grown up. It's time to hear this. Everyone is selfish, but at varying levels. In my heart, the entire Hall family is more important than me and your mother, yourself, Hibbert, and Alfred. Apart from these, it will first be Faith and good friends. Next, it's people we are acquainted with. Finally, it would be all of Backland, those who are in need of help. If it doesn't affect the ones first listed, I don't mind helping them. Unfortunately, I have to consider even more things now. At this point, Earl Hall shook his head in a self-deprecating manner. "I'm sorry to let you know that your father is such a selfish person." As Audrey listened to her father's words, her expression changed slightly at first, but then it disappeared. Until the end, there were no additional emotions. At that moment, she was silent for a moment before asking again, "But we've already obtained a lot more than what we need. Can't we even share a portion of it?" Hibbert Hall interrupted angrily. "Why are you giving away the things we painstakingly obtained to others? This is produced from our land, farmland, and forests. This is what we bought with money. And these funds and assets were passed down the family. It was earned by father's acumen and powerful charisma. It was accumulated over generations. By doing charity to help others, it's an additional display of love, not something that we have to do. Do you understand?" Earl Hall nodded. What Hibbert said is generally right. I share his thoughts as well. Audrey pursed her lips and slowly nodded. "I understand." Earl Hall retracted his gaze and said to Hibbert, "We have to keep the food stored properly. If the outcome of the war cannot be reversed, try contacting the fellows from Intis and show them some of our sincerity. The battle has been going on for so long. Quite a number of people have died as well. Many fields have been abandoned, and the prices in the cities have soared. There must be a very high demand for food, cattle, and land. In addition, I have shares in the Inti Suchit Bank, as well as the shares in the Varvat Bank and Backland Bank. I should be able to bribe them. In such times, only by satisfying these aspects can we talk about familial relationships. Intis and Lun often had marriage alliances. Many nobles were relatives, especially the believers of the god of steam. Father, are you considering surrendering? Hibbert asked in surprise. Earl Hall nodded slightly and sighed again. How can I not consider it in light of the current situation? When the time comes, you will be the new Earl Hall. Hibbert's heart palpitated when he heard that, but he was also puzzled. What about you, father? Earl Hall replied with a bitter smile. Both your mother and I are devout believers. We have a certain status in the church. When Lun falls and the church is destroyed, the outcome will not be good if we're still unwilling to step down. At this point, he comforted his eldest son. As long as the Hall family is still around and the aristocratic title is still there, we won't lose much of our core assets. We won't be in such a miserable state for our advanced years. Remember to prepare a secret prayer room for us at home after you convert your faith to the God of Steam. As the two of them conversed, Audrey, who was wearing a long, golden white dress, watched quietly from the door. She was listening quietly, her green eyes shimmering like gems. After repeated attempts, the projection of the altar vanished. The high priest of Moon City, Nim, said to German Sparrow, who was holding the strange lantern, in deliberation, "It looks like it won't work today. We can try it tomorrow. It won't last more than 2 months." At that moment, all Klein could think of was another question. Could it be that the ritual was unsuccessful, since it appears too perfunctory using historical void projections? He reflected on himself deeply and decided to listen to the high priest. They could try again tomorrow. When the time came, he would definitely get him to bring the real materials. He was about to nod when he heard a faint voice. The voice sounded from deep within the grayish-white fog. It was layered and indistinct. "It's effective? This ritual really does have an effect, but the delay is too great." Klein was delighted as he immediately raised his right hand and pressed down slightly, gesturing for the Beyonders of Moon City to be silent. He immediately held his breath and focused on listening. The voice that echoed within the grayish-white fog seemed to come from many different sources. They intertwined with each other, occasionally overlapping with each other in destructive interference and creating a resonance when in constructive interference. Gradually, the voice became clearer in Klein's ears, especially when it resonated. It seemed to be a language he was familiar with. It seemed like countless people were chanting a name together. The name was the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:15. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When he heard the voices deep in the grayish-white mist, Klein trembled slightly as the back of his head turned numb. This feeling quickly spread to every part of his body, causing tiny goosebumps to protrude on his skin. This was the second time he had heard the name the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in the real world. And the first time, it was said by Amorn after he stole his thoughts. In fact, Amorn didn't know the exact meaning behind it, nor did he truly grasp the incantation. Therefore, in essence, this was the first time. At the borders of the legendary Western continent, outside his hometown that had vanished, this was the first time that he heard the incantation that caused him to transmigrate into the real world. He heard one of the most important secrets hidden at the bottom of his heart and heard the oriental honorific name that was pointed at an unknown existence. He stood there, his mind almost blank. His ears echoed with occasional sounds of chanting and shouting. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the voices became softer and softer until they almost disappeared, Klein finally recovered his train of thought. As a fake god that had done a lot of guilty matters, his first reaction was, by changing the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings to the king of yellow and black who wields good luck, will I suffer divine punishment? Back when he had set up the 3-stanza honorific name of the fool, the first stanza described his experience and state. Back then, he had thought that it was a transmigration, and he was afraid of exposing the problem. He had changed the fool from an alternate world to the fool that doesn't belong to this era, but in the end, it pointed to his true nature. The second stanza was to bind the grey fog to him, making the direction clearer. And in order to completely limit and not cause any ambiguity, Klein directly translated the last line of the incantation, which was, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. He originally thought that it was nothing, but later on, he suspected that his transmigration was a result of the former owner of the strange door of light in Sapphira Castle, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Or rather, it was a certain existence hiding their true identity. Of course, it was also possible that the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was the actual incarnation before creating another identity that suited the present world. As for what the identity was, Klein wasn't sure. This was because he had never heard the honorific name of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings elsewhere in the real world. Therefore, Although there was suspicion and fear present, he didn't actually pay too much attention to it. It seemed like he was already used to it. However, at that moment, the words "the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings" were like salvos that kept blasting at his heart, bombarding his mind, causing all the concerns and fear that he had accumulated in his subconscious to surge out. After regaining his composure, he began to force himself to use his rationality to think about his current situation. Is this chanting hidden in the greyish-white fog, or is it from the vanished Western continent? I already thought that this fog's color and state is very close to the one below Sapphira Castle. Its power comes from history? One has to have the correct powers over time to open it? Queen of Calamity Kohainem once said that the Western continent would definitely reappear at the dawn of the apocalypse. In other words, only by pushing time towards that temporal node would the greyish-white fog come alive. Only then would it be possible to use the corresponding incantation to open it. Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. The person who made the Western continent vanish, seal it, or create a protective quarantine is the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, the existence suspected to be the previous owner of Sapphira Castle. According to all the clues, Sapphira Castle and the rest were left behind by the original creator. They were created by the various parts of his body or something that he personally created. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings is equivalent to the former owner of Sapphira Castle and also equivalent to the original creator. However, Sapphira Castle existed only after the original creator split. Furthermore, the chants of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings only point to Sapphira Castle and don't affect places like the Chaos Sea. Also, the disappearance of the Western continent is definitely something from before the Second Epoch. As an ancient god, even Elf King Saniathrim was unable to return to his hometown. In other words, in the chaotic and crazy First Epoch or even before then, the original creator, the oldest one, had split into objects like Chaos Sea and Sapphira Castle. More things happened before the ancient gods were born? These matters caused the Western continent to vanish and the former owner of Sapphira Castle to disappear? The prophecy of the ancient sun god, the city of Silver's creator, is also very interesting. It says that someone will walk out of this greyish-white fog, so he sent people to stay in Moon City and guard this place. Strictly speaking, I actually come from the Western continent or this greyish-white fog. However, I left the Western continent to enter Sapphira Castle in a time long before the ancient sun god's prediction. The year I left the greyish-white fog was 1349 and found myself in Lun. Yes, after going around in circles, I came here again and met with the people from Moon City. The ancient sun god's prophecy really has come true. It's just that the process is a little twisted and complicated, but the way it was achieved is rather unexpected. As he pondered, his mood gradually improved. This was because the situation at the scene and his spiritual intuition had told him that there were still civilizations in the Western continent that were isolated by the greyish-white fog. Many people were still alive. This method of making the Western continent vanish reminds me of the ritual for Miracle Invoker, as well as using the power of space-time. They are mainly from the Apprentice and Marauder pathways. So, the previous owner of Sapphira Castle, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, corresponds to these three neighboring pathways. Klein reined in his thoughts as he took 2 steps forward. He then turned around and said to Nim and the rest, "I heard the voice clearly." "What are they saying?" Nim's greyish-white eyes suddenly widened, his deeply pockmarked face filled with excitement. Adal, Shin, Russ, and company had similar reactions, ones that were even more intense. Even their bodies began to tremble. This was a problem that had troubled the residents of Moon City for more than 1,000 years. Resolving this problem was a symbol of escaping their current predicament. Klein took a deep breath and said in the tone of a charlatan, "They are praying to my lord." This was definitely not a lie. After all, as the fool, he had already gained initial mastery of Sapphira Castle. The last sentence of his honorific name was the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck, which was equivalent to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Nim and company fell silent. When they looked back at Klein, their eyes were filled with obvious respect and fear. Together with the miracles Klein had displayed, they gradually viewed Mr. Fool as their savior. Klein surveyed the area and said, "Retreat at least 100 meters." "All right, Your Excellency." The high priest, Nim, agreed without hesitation. After the moon cities beyond us had retreated to a sufficient distance, Klein reached into the void with his right hand and quickly dragged out another projection of himself as his actual body disappeared. Right on the heels of that, the historical void projection of Klein walked to the front of the solidified grayish-white fog. He extended his right hand and pressed it down. It was as if there was an invisible barrier that was slightly cold, blocking everything. After staring at it for 2 seconds, Klein opened his mouth, suppressed his voice, and recited in Chinese, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. As his voice echoed out, the grayish-white fog in front of him didn't react at all. It remained still and frozen. He waited for nearly a minute. After some thought, he took a deep breath and muttered again. "The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings. The Sky Lord of heaven and earth for blessings. The exalted the Arch of heaven and earth for blessings. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings." This was the complete incantation of the luck enhancement ritual. As the last word was said, Klein's right hand that was pressing on the invisible barrier suddenly felt an obvious tremble. The grey fog began to shake as though a boulder had been thrown into a lake. The ripples quickly spread, overlapping each other as they formed a door in front of him. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the scene. Not far away, the pupils of the moon city beyond us widened as they were unable to shift their eyes away. Amongst them, the ones who arrived later felt their hearts waver after witnessing such a scene. They found it impossible to contain themselves. To them, this was undoubtedly a miracle. Klein held his breath as he waited for the door to take shape. However, the ripples finally calmed down. They were only a step away from success. After a moment of silence, Klein repeated the incantations again. However, even if the ripples in the grayish-white fog didn't disappear, they were unable to truly outline the door. For a moment, he wanted to attempt with the complete ritual procedure. In other words, he would place for portions of food and recite the incantations while taking for steps counterclockwise. But very quickly, he was amused by his idea. Because by doing this, he would enter Sapphire Castle without opening the invisible barrier here. After exhaling, Klein took out a gold coin from the void and used divination to confirm that the effects of the complete ritual would be as he imagined. "It really isn't time yet because the apocalypse hasn't dawned on us." Klein looked at the grayish-white fog in front of him for a few minutes without any movement. When a bolt of lightning tore through the sky and illuminated his face, he turned around and walked in front of the Moon City High Priest, Nim, with the lantern in hand. He said calmly, "It hasn't reached the correct point in time to open it, as spoken in the Revelation. There's more than a decade of waiting left." Without waiting for any response from the likes of Nim, Adal, and the rest, Klein pointed to the nearby darkness with his empty right hand. "I will be meditating here for some time. If you want to experience the radiance of the Lord and listen to his teachings, you can come here anytime whenever the lightning frequency is high. I'll do a single purification and treatment session every day, at a time when the lightning is most frequent." He didn't attempt to get the residents of Moon City to convert their faiths, nor did he plan on heading directly to the city or ask about any specific information. He wanted to give them some time to take things in. Nim secretly heaved a sigh of relief and replied with increasingly great respect, "I will pass on your words to everyone." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:16. City of Silver, at the top of the spire, in the chief's room. With white hair and an old scar on his face, Colin Iliad looked out of the window at the deep darkness. It was only when a silvery white light suddenly burst out from afar, bringing a few seconds of light, that he retracted his gaze and nodded slightly. Chermont has succeeded in advancing. His gaze landed on the 2-meter-tall youth standing in the middle of the room. "Derek, do you know why I kept delaying the subsequent plans and didn't implement them after the first exploration of the Giant King's Court, despite already becoming a Sequence 3 Silver Knight?" Derek thought for a moment and said, "Your Excellency, on the one hand, you wish to see if there are any other paths you can take to the seaside. On the other hand, you are waiting for the other elders of the 6-member council to advance to sequence 3. And now, both matters were completed. Nearly 5 months ago, an expedition team of the City of Silver discovered a hidden path. From there, they circled around the mountain where the giant King's Court was located, and they arrived at the sea. However, the sea was illusory, and there was no way to pass through it. Forcefully entering the water only caused bodies to gradually crumble. Now, another demigod of the 6-member council, Wait Chermont, had finally advanced, becoming a Sequence 3 Silver Knight. He could have an honorific name and receive the prayers of the other residents of the City of Silver within a certain range. Colin Iliad sighed and said, "Very good. You have a very well-rounded understanding of the situation. If I had a choice, I truly do not wish to bring you to the giant King's Court again and attempt to open the palace where Dark Angel lays in slumber." At this point, Demon Hunter Colin paused for a moment before continuing, "I do not know what danger such an expedition will bring. I can only make ample preparations in advance. Now, Chermont has finally succeeded. Even if an accident happens later and we are unable to return, he and the other elders will be able to support the City of Silver, allowing everything to continue on as we await the next opportunity." He sized up Derek for a few seconds before nodding in acknowledgement. "Your growth is even better than I expected. If not for the fact that the giant King's Court matter originated because of you, I'd really want to keep you in the City of Silver and be an understudy elder of the 6-member council." Upon hearing this, Derek Berg replied without hesitation, "Even if you wish to keep me here in the City of Silver, I would still apply to go." This was a glimmer of hope that he had seen. This was an opportunity in his heart that could save the City of Silver. He was willing to sacrifice everything for it. Colin Iliad gave a rare smile. "You are still too young. After you experience many things like me, you will understand that compared to drawing your sword and sacrificing your blood in a zealous fervor, enduring humiliation and helplessness and persisting in the darkness is even more difficult and painful. If you don't believe me, you can ask Chermont later. Ask him if he is willing to lead an expedition team to the giant King's Court or stay in the City of Silver." Derek fell into silence, his mouth agape, but not a single word came out of it. Colin Iliad didn't continue on this topic and instead asked, "Have you completely digested the Priest of Light potion?" "I digested it completely last week," Derek replied frankly. Colin Iliad nodded and said, "Have you gathered all the supplementary ingredients?" Derek acknowledged tersely, "I've gathered all of them. I'm just short of preparing the ritual." His ritual required him to extract the strongest emotions that he was unwilling to abandon, before injecting them again after consuming the potion. After a few gatherings with the Tarot Club, as well as Miss Justice's private attempts, they had already come up with a well-formulated plan. He was to complete it by relying on this sequence for Manipulator's control of the Psyche domain, and Mr. Fool's Angel's embrace. Demon Hunter Colin didn't rush him as he calmly said, "Don't be anxious. The second exploration of the giant King's Court will still take some time." "Until I become an unshadowed?" Derek asked. Colin Iliad didn't deny it as he nodded slightly. "I'm also waiting for Lovia to become a Black Knight. Her ingredients and ritual have been prepared." Upon hearing this, Derek immediately felt pressured. At the capital of the Rorsted Archipelago, City of Generosity, Biome. At the top of the bell tower of the City of Generosity. The Cardinal of the Church of Storms, the high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, Sea King John Cotman, stood behind the railing, looking at the sea which was no longer that blue. There was wreckage floating above it, burning with the remains of ships. "Humph, in my territory at sea, even a war bishop has to bow his head." The muscular demigod with a chiseled face retracted his gaze as he muttered. He had a head of dark blue hair and a pair of deep blue eyes that were as thick as a worm. He controlled the weather and sea around the Rorsted Archipelago. FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. Alger Wilson, who was standing beside the Sea King, didn't show any signs of frustration. He patiently waited until John Cotman turned his attention onto him. Aside from most of the Beyonders of the Sailor pathway being bad-tempered, they often trembled in submission when facing high-sequence Beyonders of the same pathway. This was a characteristic of a tyrant. After muttering to himself, Sea King John Cotman finally cast his gaze at Alger, who was leading a pirate fleet. He said without any expression, "Your performance this time was remarkable. The Council of Cardinals has passed your review and has decided that I will preside over your advancement ritual." After receiving the item left behind by Queen of Calamity Kohinam, Alger found an opportunity to report the matter to Sea King John Cotman. Apart from 2 details that he modified, he had given an honest account of the exploration of the elven ruins from the time he arrived in the primitive forest of Sonia Island. Firstly, he claimed that he had headed for the elven ruins as part of him taking the initiative to ambush the Phaeacian troops. They had specially looked for a suitable venue, and there were many sailors present to verify it. The second was to lessen the autonomy of the subsequent actions. He only claimed that he dreamed of a female high elf on the night of his exploration of the ruins. Nothing abnormal happened after he drank a glass of wine from her, so he hadn't paid too much attention to it. When he came to the Rorsted archipelago and woke up one night from his sleep, he suddenly realized that he had entered a magnificent palace at the bottom of the sea, and had picked up a sparking coral. Although many aspects of the evidence and physical evidence had indicated that Alger's description was real, Sea King John Cotman didn't fully believe it. He was sent back to Parzu Island to be investigated by the Pontiff, Guard 2. With the help of Angel's Embrace, Alger looked like he was trembling in front of the tyrant's aura. Without holding back, he explained that he had developed a certain degree of ambition after meeting the female high elf in his dreams. For this, he had taken the initiative to head to the Rorsted archipelago in hopes of receiving her inheritance, but in reality, he had covered up the core secrets and the most serious problem. He had used the method of confessing his ambition to pass the investigation. As for the female high elf, whether it was a result of him having some elven blood that a fortuitous encounter was given to him, or if she had any hidden motives, he claimed that he was unsure. He hoped that the Pontiff could figure out the answer to lessen his worries. Alger displayed his fear of the unknown, making the Cardinals believe that this was the main reason why he had reported the fortuitous encounter. This proposal was designed by Alger himself, but with Miss Justice's suggestions, it was tweaked to be more in line with human nature. Of course, as expected, Alger didn't receive the advancement ritual. Instead, he entered an inspection period. The Pontiff of the Church of Storms, the grounded angel, had reinforced the seal in Alger's body, preventing the cataclysmic Intoa characteristic from seeping out for 2 years and affecting him. In the past half a year, Alger had led the pirate fleet that had been assigned to him. He had worked hard to harass the ships of Phaesac and Phaenopotter. He had even participated in sea battles, taking great risks and making numerous contributions. This fully expressed his devotion to the Lord of Storms, as well as his submission to the orders given by the Church. Finally, after this Rorsted sea battle, the situation had escalated. His patience paid off as the Council of Cardinals acknowledged him. Alger took a deep breath and struck his right fist to his left breast, shouting loudly, "Holy Lord of Storms!" His agitation was half an act, while the other half came from the bottom of his heart. This was because in the past half year, he had suffered quite a bit of pressure. Hermit had already finished digesting the Mysticologist potion and was preparing to advance to Sequence 3, Clairvoyant. Although Miss Justice had yet to fully digest the Manipulator potion, she had made significant progress. Furthermore, she was a complete rookie when she first joined the Tarot Club. Now, she had become a true demigod. She wasn't just a sequence higher than Alger, but a whole tier. Before long, the sun could advance to Sequence 4, Unshadowed, and obtain Guardhood. The star had also finished digesting the Sequence 5 potion and had accumulated a significant amount of contributions. He was just waiting for the higher-ups to give him a chance. Miss Magician wasn't far from digesting her potion after traveling time and time again. Furthermore, her teacher had prepared the corresponding sequence for secret sorcerer ingredients for her. There was no need to mention the world German sparrow. Even if he were to suddenly inform them that he was an angel, Alger wouldn't find it surprising. Miss Judgment was currently a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin. She was digesting the potion and was trying her best to keep up with everyone's progress. The moon, who didn't like to work hard, became anxious as a result and was seeking to become a sanguine earl. Faced with such a situation, as one of the most senior members of the Tarot Club, Alger naturally didn't wish to be left behind. He desperately wished to advance to Sequence 4 and become a demigod. So many days had gone by, yet he suppressed his anxiety and patiently waited. There were 2 instances where he showed signs of losing control, which required him to hire Miss Justice to treat him. And now, he finally got the answer he wanted the most. He had passed the assessment and was to prepare for the ritual. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12-17. Moon City. Many humans walked out of buildings which stood unusually sturdily despite having mottled surfaces. Some of them were obviously deformed, while others had already developed some abnormalities. The humans looked at each other and noticed some confusion on each other's faces. There were still 2 to 3 months before the sun sacrifice. Why was the high priest summoning everyone to the square? Could something have happened? The residents of Moon City were filled with anxiety, fear, and confusion as they entered the only square from every street. At this moment, the high platform was empty. The person who had convened them appeared to have not arrived. The residents of Moon City gathered together in a very orderly manner according to their respective zones, and they discussed amongst each other in whispers. Why isn't the high priest here yet? Doesn't he like to wait and not want others to wait for him? What happened exactly? Why did he suddenly gather all the city's residents aside from the guards? Amidst the voices, at the top of a tower near the square, High Priest Nim leaned against the wall and looked at the square from behind the crystal glass with a twisted expression as he endured something. His greyish-white hair flared up as a bunch of short black hair grew on his face. His ribs and waist were squirming, forming a swollen patch. These abnormal changes would disappear and occasionally appear. It was as if he was suffering from relapses again and again. His entire being was sinister and terrifying. After about a minute, he finally calmed down. He let out a long breath and wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. Just now, he had been resisting the madness that had accumulated in his body. In fact, no matter which beyond pathway it was, the higher the sequence, the greater the insanity and inhuman inclinations one had. This gradually exceeded one's own humanity. One had to rely on external anchors to maintain a balance. Normally, such situations weren't obvious at Sequence 4 and Sequence 3. And at the level of an angel, even if there were enough anchors to stabilize them, they would fall into darkness from time to time. In the negative and abnormal states, one had to endure and resist on their own, waiting for them to ease up. They were like a sacred and solemn existence who might appear unproblematic normally. They could respond to prayers, chat normally, and even joke. However, at times, they could only hide in dark rooms and in the shadows. They tore off the surface of their skin, revealing a sinister side that showed signs of madness. As Nim often ate monster flesh, he had accumulated a lot of toxins, corruption, and madness. This forced him to endure such pain despite being a Sequence 4. Of course, those who didn't know the acting method and relied on time or luck to advance to Sequence 4 and Sequence 3 would also share the same fate. After composing himself, he turned and left the room. With the help of an illusory door, he appeared on the high platform in the middle of the square. After the discussions died down, the residents of Moon City cast doubtful and uneasy gazes at the high priest. Nim looked around and directly said, "The hunting team led by Adal met an outsider." An outsider? The eyes of the residents of Moon City suddenly widened as though it was a bolt from out of the blue. This was the first time in 2,000 years for Moon City to encounter an outsider. Of course, this was referring to human interaction and not monsters. Nim took a deep breath and continued, "He claims to be a missionary who's here to spread the light of a deity. He caused the greyish-white fog to undergo obvious changes. He cleansed Adal and the others of the corruption and toxins accumulated within them. Also, he treated their physical mutations." As he spoke, he nodded to the side of the platform, and Adal and Shin, who were hiding in the shadows, immediately passed through the row of torches and walked to his side, using their own conditions to prove what the high priest had just said. Oh my God! Is that Adal and Shin? They really? Exclamations sounded out as surprise and shock mixed together into something almost physical. Adal and Shin exchanged looks, took 2 steps forward, and recounted what their hunting team encountered. The crowd heard about the tiny flame that appeared in the darkness, the cross that emitted a bright light, the cane that could cure any mutations and ailments, the parting of the greyish-white fog, as well as the appearance of the door. Upon hearing the hunting team's delightful description of their excellent condition, the residents of Moon City gradually fell silent. Some of them had already unknowingly teared up a result of the extreme fatigue and repression. Finally, they saw a ray of light. The tears carried a mild and salty feeling as they flowed past their faces, slipping across the corner of their lips and dripping onto the ground. In addition, a person who was still rational and clear-headed raised his arm to express his opinion. Could that missionary be a special monster from deep within the darkness? Are Adal and Shin acting like this because they've already been controlled and influenced? After the wave of doubt calmed down, Nim said in a deep and clear voice, I've checked them and have also used the sealed artifacts. I haven't found anything unusual for the time being. I will let them remain in the Black Tower and undergo at least 15 days of quarantine. After making the promise, he paused and said that missionary named German Sparrow will be meditating in the vicinity of the greyish-white fog for some time. He has permitted us to experience the glory of the God he believes in and listen to the corresponding teachings. And every day, at the time when the lightning frequency is highest, he will provide cleansing and treatment. Everyone can make their own decision on heading over there, but they have to report their decision in advance and follow instructions. No one is to act on their own accord and affect the city's defenses. After they return, they will be quarantined for 15 days like Adal and Shin. The residents of Moon City fell silent. They looked at each other, unable to make up their minds. At this moment, Russ and another member of the hunting team, who had previously missed the cleansing and treatment because of their choice to return to inform the High Priest, stepped forward. High Priest, I'm going. All right, I'll lead this team tomorrow. Nim nodded and agreed. He had originally planned to give this team a name, but he failed to come up with a good description. He could only stammer and skip it. In his heart, there was actually a name, but he didn't dare say it out loud. It was Pilgrimage. With Russ and company leading the way, several Moon City residents stood forward, indicating that they were willing to take the risk. When the frequency of lightning increased, it was the dawn of a brand new day. A group of 7 to 8 Moon City residents carried animal hide lanterns and began to traverse the darkness, heading towards the periphery of the greyish-white fog. After darkness and light exchanged countless times, Russ and company's eyes suddenly lit up. It was a bonfire that was slowly burning. German Sparrow, who was wearing strange clothes and a strange hat, was sitting around it. He held an iron-black long skewer and was roasting something. There were corpses of monsters lying around the bonfire. On these corpses, there were all sorts of strange objects. Some of them were white and full, as if they would spew out liquids the moment they were poked. Some of them were black, embedded with blood-colored lines and marbling. Some were covered with golden spots, while the tops were the size of a palm. These items were densely packed, covering the different parts of the monster's corpse. They had a strange and alluring beauty to them. After taking a few steps forward, High Priest Nim noticed that German Sparrow was roasting one of the strange objects. Drops of oil dripped down and produced sizzling sounds in the fire, brightening the light and allowing an alluring fragrance to spread. Gulp! The residents of Moon City swallowed their saliva instinctively as they developed an irresistible urge to eat. Every cell of theirs was screaming crazily. I wish to eat it. I want to eat it. Give it to me. Sitting on a rock, Klein raised his head and pointed at the colorful objects growing on the corpses of the monsters around him. He said in a deep voice, these are called mushrooms. They're divided into different types. If you're willing, you can pick and eat them yourself, but do not touch the black ones. Furthermore, they have to be thoroughly cooked before you can eat them. Otherwise, you will encounter a terrifying curse. The high priest of Moon City thought for a moment and replied on behalf of the others, "We would like to first listen to your Lord's teachings and experience his irradiance." With a slight nod, Klein said as he rotated the long barbecue skewer that he had summoned from the historical void, "You may sit down and listen." When the 8 Moon City residents sat opposite the bonfire, he said with a solemn expression, "I came from the Giant King's Court." This was a term that all the residents of Moon City were familiar with. Their spirits were instantly lifted as they cast their attention away from the items above the burning fire and cast it at German Sparrow. Following that, Klein described the situation outside the City of Silver and the situation beyond the Cursed Land. He also shared with them his sightings of city ruins along the way. The residents of Moon City sighed when they heard this. Sometimes they looked forward to it, but sometimes they found it hard to believe. At times, they could empathize with it and be filled with sorrow. Halfway through his sentence, Klein suddenly stopped. He retracted the black long metal skewer, brought it to his mouth, and bit down on a mushroom. Thick meat juices seeped out and, with a slightly scorching feeling, cleansed his mouth. After spending half a year in the forsaken land of the gods, Klein had already overcome his disgust towards mushrooms. After all, Danitz was often tasked by him with things to do. He was unable to meticulously prepare food and sacrifice things to him. During this period, he could only rely on mushrooms for sustenance. He closed his eyes in satisfaction and handed over the long, black skewer. He smiled and said, "You can try some." FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. High Priest Nim was still hesitant when Russ reached out his hand. As he expressed his gratitude, he got a mushroom and put it into his mouth. He ate too quickly, so much so that his mouth was scalded. However, after his expression twisted, it suddenly froze. Following that, his expression slowly relaxed as he gradually revealed a sense of intoxication, pleasure, and yearning. In the end, Russ's tears flowed out unknowingly as he muttered in a deep, choking voice, "This is the best and most superb food I've ever eaten." Even though their taste for food had changed after generations, humans couldn't adapt to food with toxins and madness. They still yearned for sugar and fat. At that moment, all the residents of Moon City could tell that Russ was moved. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:18. Give it a try too. Klein handed the iron black long skewer to the other residents of Moon City. Their throats bobbed up and down as they couldn't help but swallow another mouthful of saliva. However, they didn't immediately respond. All of them cast their gazes at the high priest, waiting for him to nod. In his animal hide clothes, Nim took out an item. It looked like a magnifying glass with a handle. At a glance, Klein almost imagined that he had seen a monocle. This fright made his heart skip a beat. Thankfully, he managed to control himself in time to confirm the details. Holding the metallic handle, he placed the glass object in front of his right eye and observed Russ for a few seconds through the lens. After a brief silence, he put down the item and nodded at the other Moon City residents. People other than Russ finally reached out their hands and carefully removed a mushroom from the iron black long skewer and stuffed it into their mouths. The item that was void of nauseous smells and foulness made them instantly become intoxicated. Without caring about the scorching feeling in their oral cavities, they swallowed the mushrooms into their stomachs and instinctively reached out for another one. However, all the mushrooms on the iron black long skewer had already been distributed. Nim retracted his gaze from the iron black long skewer and waited for German Sparrow to continue explaining his experiences and the fool's teachings. Klein looked around and repeated the words he had previously said. The surrounding mushrooms can be taken at any time, apart from the pure black ones. In addition, they have to be fully cooked before they can be eaten. Otherwise, you will be cursed. The residents of Moon City no longer hesitated. They immediately stood up and chose the mushrooms that they had been longing for. With a glance, Klein added, "When the white mushrooms are cooked, they easily split open and have liquids flow out. You need to prepare some containers or drink them once that happens." Without waiting for Russ and company to respond, he continued the topic that he had previously stopped mid-explanation. He went on until he mentioned how he heard the voices in the greyish-white fog chant Mr. Fool's honorific name. Seeing that High Priest Nim so absorbed by his tales, to the point of being a little moved, Klein deliberated and said, "There are still many ways to make the greyish-white fog react, but they are all related to my lord." This was a reasonable guess. This was because not only was there one hanging person, but there wasn't only one way to enter the world above the grey fog. If Emperor Razel had brought the mysterious silver plate that he had replicated here, there was a high chance that the invisible barrier would produce an anomaly. Of course, the prerequisite was that the Emperor belonged to one of the three pathways of seer, apprentice, or marauder. Seeing that there were no doubts from the others, Klein said warmly, "According to my observations, there isn't only one Beyonder pathway in Moon City." The grizzled Nim didn't hide it from him and simply replied, "Yes, when we were selected to come to Moon City, the Oracle had intentionally ensured that there was a comprehensive record of Beyonder pathways. Unfortunately, after all these years and the repeated disasters, many of the potion formulas and Beyonder ingredients of the various pathways have been lost." "Which pathway are you from?" Klein asked casually as he looked at the residents of Moon City using monster bones to roast the mushrooms. "I'm a Night Watcher," Nim said frankly. "Sequence for Night Watcher of the Evernight pathway?" Klein nodded slightly and asked, "Did anything unusual happen near this greyish-white fog?" After pondering for about 10 seconds, Nim with his pockmarked face said, "Yes." Klein's heart stirred as he calmly asked, "What kind of abnormality was it?" Nim glanced at the mushrooms that emitted fragrant smells, and he deliberated over his words. A small hill suddenly disappeared, leaving only a deep crater in the ground. There were no signs of an explosion in that area, nor was there any soil scattered around. "What's going on?" "That's a little bizarre." As he threw the mushroom's roots into the fire to turn them into fuel for the flames, Klein asked without any change in expression, "Did you investigate further?" "Yes." The High Priest of Moon City nodded and said, "An investigation team encountered a demonic wolf there. It wasn't a demonic wolf that has already rotted or mutated, but the kind of demonic wolf from a long time ago." "Demonic wolf?" Klein didn't expect to hear such information. His pupils changed slightly as he asked, "What did that demonic wolf look like?" Nim unconsciously took a deep breath and said, "It's the same as the demonic wolves described in ancient literature, but it's even bigger. Even though its 8 legs are on the ground, it's still as tall as 2 or 3 people combined. Its fur wasn't pure black. It exuded a dark and deep feeling. Its eyes were very strange. The black pupils took up a large part of the eyes. Also, there was a tuft of grey short hair on its head. FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. Isn't that the dark demonic wolf, Kota? It actually came to the far east of the forsaken land of the gods and was involved in an anomaly. If the power of the Western continent's disappearance really comes from Sapphira Castle, it would still be quite normal for it to attract the mythical creatures that corresponded to Miracle Invoker." Klein frowned slightly and said, "It didn't attack your investigation team?" Klein had deliberately used it instead of he to prevent frightening the residents of Moon City. In his opinion, it was very easy for the dark demonic wolf, Kota, to wipe out an investigation team. It didn't even need to pay a huge price to turn the city into his marionette kingdom. Yet, this mythical creature had apparently spared Moon City. If not for the spirit body threads that he had seen in advance and that he confirmed their conditions, Klein would have suspected that he was only talking to a few marionettes. "No, it left in a hurry," Nim replied. "This doesn't match the suspicious and cautious nature of the dark demonic wolf. What frightened him so much that he fled in such a hurry? He didn't even have the time to silence the people who saw him. Or rather, there's something special about the people guarding Moon City under the ancient sun god's revelation, and unless it's necessary, the dark demonic wolf wouldn't attack them." Klein continued without any change in his tone. "Did it leave any tracks?" "No." Nim firmly shook his head. "Other than the hill turning into a deep crater, we didn't discover anything unusual." As his thoughts raced, Klein tried to ask from another angle. When did this happen? The more he understood an object from the past, the more he could make contact with it in the fog of history. After some thought, Nim said, 2 years ago, 2 months, and 10 days ago. He immediately explained, there are too few things worth recording. It left a deep impression on me. 2 years ago, 2 months and 10 days ago. Currently, it's the 8th of September, 1351, and subtracting that time, it would be the 28th of June, 1349. This. Klein's right hand suddenly trembled slightly. His pupils and his expression were normal, but this was a result of using his clown powers to control them. He remembered very clearly that on the 28th of June, 1349, he had transmigrated. It was the day he became Klein Moretti, it was the day he repeated the luck enhancement ritual and entered Sapphira Castle. The abnormality here, the appearance of the dark demonic wolf, and the hasty departure of this mythical creature were all related to me. A huge wave of emotion surged through his heart. For a moment, he couldn't find an explanation and pretended that nothing had happened. He thought for a moment and asked, did something similar happen in the past 2,000 to 3,000 years? No. Nim gave a clear answer. What about 208 years ago? Did anything special happen? Klein asked. That was the time when Emperor Roselle transmigrated to this world. After hesitating for 2 seconds, Nim said, I can't tell you the answer. I need to go back and read the corresponding records. Thankfully, the information and documents in the past 3 centuries haven't been damaged. At this point, he added, my limited impression tells me that there shouldn't be anything special. If that's the case, then the cause of this anomaly was because I entered the world above the grey fog and bound Sapphira Castle to myself. Klein nodded slightly and didn't ask further. He simply said, tell me where the crater is. By the time the high priest, Nim, gave an answer, the mushrooms that the residents of Moon City had grilled could be eaten. Some of them took a small bite of the white mushrooms and were scalded by the milk inside. They couldn't bear to spit it out. Some chewed repeatedly, reminiscing over the faint sweetness. Some of them couldn't stop eating at all. Nim was taken aback by what he saw, as though he couldn't believe that these people were from Moon City. Every one of them was showing the conflicted looks of having cravings and being satisfied. Their expressions looked twisted, but they were brimming with pure joy. High priest, try it as well. Ras, whose eyes were very close to each other, handed a mushroom covered in golden spots that emitted a unique and sweet fragrance to Nim. After hesitating for a moment, Nim carefully used the magnifying glass to take a look before taking the mushroom and stuffing it into his mouth. In the next second, his expression changed slightly as he slowly closed his eyes. He had a taste of something similar from some mutated tree roots, but it wasn't as pure or memorable. After an unknown period of time, he looked at the indifferent German sparrow and said with an abnormally sincere tone, Your Excellency, we would like to listen to Mr. Fool's teachings. I haven't had the time to make it up yet. However, as I'm getting closer and closer to being an angel, the corresponding matters should be prioritized. The anchors need to be prepared in advance. As his thoughts raced, Klein recalled what he had said when he had Trikedno come up with to reform the believers of Sea God. His expression quickly turned solemn as he raised his right hand and grabbed at the void. He pulled out a cross covered in bronze and sharp spikes. Following that, he pressed his right thumb onto a thorn, letting the blood enter the unshadowed crucifix. The bronze-green surface of the unshadowed crucifix quickly peeled off, revealing a body made of pure sunlight. God said. Klein opened his mouth and said in a low voice as he raised the resplendent cross in his hand a lot higher. Warm and bright light surged out like a tidal wave, instantly filling the surrounding area. The darkness and discomfort accumulated in the bodies of Nim, Russ, and company began to rapidly melt away. It was as if their bodies were being cleansed. They were in a daze when they heard the oracle, who was holding the resplendent cross and covered in holy radiance, solemnly say, God said. First commandment, thou shalt not sacrifice unto me living human sacrifices. Second commandment, thou shalt not use my name in vain. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:19. In the fog sea, which hadn't been engulfed by war, the future slowly began to sail towards the berserk sea amidst a convoy of ships. Admiral of Stars Katlia hadn't had much to do recently. All she had to do was wait for the Moses ascetic order to respond to her request. As she strolled the deck, she enjoyed the sunlight that shone through the thin mist. With a sweep of her gaze, she saw Frank Lee. This first mate of the future, the second most important person of the Star Pirates, was wearing light blue pants and a white shirt with the top 2 buttons unbuttoned, revealing thick brown chest hair. He was like a human or a giant bear. He stood at the bow of the boat, looking into the distance. It was unknown what he was thinking, but he looked rather down. Katlia involuntarily slowed down a little as she turned to enter the cabin. "Captain!" Frank noticed her and looked over with anticipation, as though he was waiting for this Admiral of Stars to answer his questions. Katlia's figure paused as she adjusted the heavy glasses on her nose and asked in a seemingly casual manner, "What are you stumped with?" Frank thought about how to phrase his question and replied in a serious manner, "I'm re-evaluating the inventions and creations I've created over the years." "What are your thoughts?" Katlia asked cooperatively. Frank nodded and said in distress, "There are too many matters I need to reflect on. The most important thing is that the things I've created are still missing the most important thing." Katlia was puzzled, but she didn't wish to ask further. In the end, she still held on to the thought of taking responsibility for all the crew members on the future. She deliberated and said, "What is it?" Frank's expression instantly turned solemn. "They all lack souls. It's a good thing that malt, grapes, and mushrooms don't have souls." Katlia subconsciously advised before saying, "This isn't something you can dabble in right now. You're only a Sequence 5 druid." Frank's eyes lit up when he heard that as he blurted out, "I've got it." Katlia frowned indiscernibly. "What did you get?" Frank was no longer depressed. "I understand the problem. That is, the creations I want have exceeded the limits of a druid's abilities. Therefore, Captain, I'm not going to be a druid anymore. I want to become a classical alchemist." This was Sequence 4 of the planter pathway, the starting point of a demigod. Katlia's expression froze for a few seconds before she took on the posture of a captain and a demigod. She nodded gently and said, "Having a goal is a good thing, but you have to understand how difficult it is." Underlying those words, she wanted him to not hold any hopes and not to take this goal seriously. Frank Lee nodded heavily after receiving her encouragement. "I will do my best." To prevent Frank Lee from acting rashly, Katlia decided to take the progress of the matter into her own hands. "I will help you too." When the time came, even if she had any progress, she could inform Frank Lee that she had tried to no avail. Frank was very happy as he thanked his captain from the bottom of his heart before continuing, "I'll also write to German Sparrow and ask him for help. He's my good friend." What Frank didn't know was that the letters he had written for the past half a year had gone through a rather convoluted process. The letter went to the messenger before being delivered to Force. Force would then transfer it to German Sparrow or request Mr. Fool's help at the tarot gathering. Katlia nudged her thick glasses again and, without another word, turned and entered the cabin. She returned to the captain's cabin. Before she could think about what had just happened, she saw a letter on the desk with the brass sextant. Katlia was delighted. Ignoring the use of her Beyonder powers, she quickly walked over, picked up the letter, and opened it. It was from Bernadette. After exchanging a few simple pleasantries, she wrote, "If you are free anytime, you can come to La Cha incognito." La Cha was a rather hidden island in the Fog Sea. It hid Queen Mystic's palace, also known as Emerald City. Katlia repeated the sentence a few times before the corners of her mouth curled up involuntarily. Backland, Westborough, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White once again met the middle-aged, gentlemanly sanguine Baron, Cosme Odora. What did Lord Nibs say? Emlyn controlled his emotions, trying his best to appear less eager. Cosme looked at Emlyn's bright red eyes and said, "He only wanted me to tell you that the entire sanguine race doesn't have any excess Earl Beyonder characteristics. You can only wait for the present Earls to die of old age or accidents, leaving behind their inheritance." Compared to humans, the sanguine had a long lifespan. Even without a noble title, ordinary ones could live about 300 years old. Under such circumstances, they could slowly accumulate and occupy every level, preventing any excess in beyonder characteristics. Therefore, it wasn't easy for ordinary ones to advance to Baron or become a Viscount. They either waited for the existing nobles to die, or they would obtain it from external sources. Otherwise, they would have to make sufficient contributions and receive the precious inheritance. Compared to the first two sequences, it was even more difficult for a Viscount to become an Earl. This was because being a sanguine Earl meant being a demigod, and he could easily live for more than 1,000 years. Those Viscounts' descendants had to pass generations before they could wait for a chance of an Earl's passing. And it was precisely because of this that, as long as there was a vacancy in the Earl position, it would immediately be distributed and not in stock. For Baron and Viscount characteristics, they existed in the sanguine's treasury in the form of beyonder ingredients and sealed artifacts, but the numbers were few and far between. Every bestowment had to be strictly administered. There really weren't any spare Earl characteristics. This answer was within Emlyn's expectations. He looked at Baron Cosme and nodded slightly. In other words, as long as any count passes away, it will be my turn? No. Cosme shook his head. Although you have contributed plenty, you haven't reached first place on the waiting list yet. What's my ranking? Emlyn first frowned before relaxing his brows to prevent his eagerness from showing. Cosme coughed and cleared his throat. 12th. This might not even happen when the apocalypse arrives. Since the ancestor has given me the important task of saving the race, why didn't she arrange all these matters? My Scarlet Scholar potion has been digested for months. Could it be that another test? Emlyn thought to himself silently for a few seconds before asking thoughtfully, if I obtain an Earl's characteristic from external sources, will the race help me prepare the ritual? Cosme exhaled and said, of course. Emlyn didn't stay any longer. He left Odora's villa and took a carriage back to his residence. Ever since Fainapotter declared war on Lun, he had never been to the Harvest Church. He had only heard from the Star that the door had been smashed and many things had been stolen. It had become a place for the homeless. As for Father Utravsky, he spent half a month in a cell behind Channy's gate. The rest of the month was spent in a room on the upper level of St. Samuel Cathedral, with the Archbishop of Backlund next door. This arrangement was repeated over and over again. This was because they were worried that if Father Utravsky were to stay behind Channy's gate for an extended period of time, he would suffer irreversible damage. Under such a tense situation, the Church of Evernite wished to leave some buffer time so that they could use this opportunity to express their goodwill and begin negotiations. Although Emlyn wasn't a believer in Evernite, and he even somewhat detested the cathedral, he went to St. Samuel Cathedral twice a month to visit Father Utravsky. Where can I obtain an Earl's characteristic? Emlyn, who felt that he had fallen behind and might not be able to bear the responsibility of saving his race, looked at the bleak streets while seriously considering every possibility. He quickly had some ideas. Hermit had mentioned before that the Aurora Order Saint, St. Tenebrous, had grazed a shaman king. This corresponded to the Earl characteristic. If I could hunt this demigod of the shepherd pathway like the Saint of Secrets, the problem would be resolved. However, after the previous lesson, St. Tenebrous probably wouldn't fall into a trap so easily. There's also a possibility of directly attracting a king of angels. This was something everyone had discussed in the Tarot Club. The conclusion was that they had been attacking the Aurora Order for the past year, so it was best not to provoke them further. Apart from St. Tenebrous having a sequence for Shaman King characteristic, Emlyn White could only think of one other option. The Rose School of Thought. Be it the Life School of Thought's artificial vampires or the primordial moon worshippers that originally existed in the southern continent, they were now part of the Rose School of Thought. Of course, there were definitely some people who sought freedom. They hadn't joined any organizations yet, but either they were not at high sequences, or they didn't have enough information to leak out. Upon thinking of the Rose School of Thought, Emlyn instantly recalled a person. Marek. Marek represented the temperance faction of the Rose School of Thought. It was a faction that resisted the Mother Tree of Desire. FINDD new updates on NOV/E/Elbin.com. They also appear like they want to obtain something from the Rose School of Thought. Perhaps I can cooperate with them. Enlin nodded slightly. A number of residents in Moon City anxiously gathered at the entrance, casting their sights east from time to time. They were the relatives of the people who had previously been led by the High Priest. They were also the representatives of most people in Moon City. Finally, as the flames flickered, High Priest Nim brought Russ and company closer to Moon City. A man went forward and looked at his sister. He noticed that there were still traces of tears on her face. This Moon City resident, who wasn't deformed, could sense her brother's gaze. She couldn't help but open her mouth, tears streaming down her face. God is here to save us. She started to cry. It was such a sad and free cry as she let out her emotions. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 12:20. God is here to save us. The word spoken in a sob-filled voice echoed at the entrance of Moon City, causing the residents who were waiting to fall into a trance. At the edges of the greyish-white fog, a fire quietly burned. After eating another batch of mushrooms, Klein dispelled the iron-black skewer in his hand and looked up at the crater described by Moon City's High Priest, Nim. He then reached out with his right hand and gently pulled, dragging himself out from 15 minutes ago. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/lb.in.com. After exchanging looks, Klein's true form rapidly vanished and entered the fog of history. He ran all the way to a time before the first epoch, and he sat in the old stacked cities. His historical projection stood up and snapped his fingers repeatedly, flashing through the crimson flames as he headed for his destination. When the crater that was once a hill was almost right in front of him, he stopped. He cautiously extended his right palm and pulled Kona's Kilger out of the void. The burly Earl of the Fallen's facial muscles twitched as he quickly transformed into another German sparrow. He took out a lantern from the fog of history with one hand and rubbed his temples with the other as he muttered softly, "Why does a marionette have to change its appearance? There's no one else here. I can't develop OCD." A few seconds later, the marionette's projection carried a lantern that emitted faint yellow light as it walked towards the crater not far away. As the light flickered, Klein saw his target location and realized that it wasn't too deep. The difference between the bottom and the ground wasn't more than 2 meters. Of course, compared to the original hill, this change was indeed huge. Inside the crater, the soil was smooth, and there were a few rocks in it. There were many twisted, mutated plants around it whose species were difficult to distinguish. It looked no different from other places. After observing for a while, Klein, who had stealthily activated Spirit Body Threads and Spirit Body Threads vision, slowly entered the crater, planning on following his pre-planned route and reassessing everything worth paying attention to. As he walked, he frowned slightly and let out an exclamation. He realized that his thoughts had turned sluggish, but it didn't affect his thinking. It was as if he had slept too much and had just woken up having a heavy head with insufficiently active thoughts. This was a situation that a person would occasionally experience. Beyond us of the other pathways might not be able to detect it, but as a demigod of the seer pathway, Klein could clearly sense something amiss. If it were any deeper, it would be close to the effect when a marionettist controls spirit body threads. The influence left behind by Dark Demonic Wolf Kota? That's not right. If he didn't mean to leave it behind, it means that he showed his complete mythical creature form back then. That would have resulted in Moon City's investigation team in breaking down and losing control. If he had intentionally left it behind, what would be the purpose? Telling others that he was here? Klein circled the area in puzzlement, but he didn't discover any anomalies. After some thought, he let his main body that was hiding in the historical void in a time before the first epoch take 4 steps counterclockwise as he recited the incantation and went above the grey fog. He wanted to do a divination. With the exact time and location, Nim's description, and a real-world survey of the area, as well as lighting up some of the historical fragments, he believed that the prerequisite for making a divination had basically been met. This didn't mean it was enough, but that he could barely give it a try. Besides, if the hill turning into a crater incident had something to do with Sapphira Castle and him, then the chances of a successful divination would greatly increase. The revelation would be very clear and not be interfered with. Without any further thought, he sat on the fool's high-back chair. He conjured a dark red fountain pen and yellow parchment and wrote, "The 28th of June 1349 of the 5th epoch. The anomaly that happened here." He put down the fountain pen and grabbed with his left hand. He pulled out a handful of crater soil from the fog of history to use it as a medium for divination. With one hand holding the soil and the other holding the parchment, he leaned back in his chair and recited the divination statement 7 times. Then, with the help of cogitation, he fell asleep. In the hazy dream world, Klein saw the grayish-white solidified fog. He saw the hill that was tens of meters high and the twisted vegetation around it. A few seconds later, the fog began to churn and rapidly vomited a black shadow. The black shadow was like a huge velvet curtain, madly absorbing all the light around it. Its translucency increased as it completely enveloped the hill. Following that, the hill vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a crater. The strange plants at the edge of the crater were also suddenly covered and had black illusory spirit body threads that extended towards different parts of the black curtain. The curtain became more and more transparent and illusory until it reached a point where one couldn't see it with the naked eye. If not for the fact that he had spirit body threads vision to observe the reality of the scene, Klein wouldn't have been able to discover that the curtain had covered the crater's surface. The scene flashed, and the dreamscape twisted to reveal a new scene. Moon City's 5-man patrol team approached and discovered that a crater had replaced the hill that had vanished. They stopped in their tracks and left the area without hesitation. They didn't rashly investigate. After an unknown period of time, a gigantic figure suddenly appeared in another direction. It was a demonic wolf covered in dark fur with 8 legs. It was about 4 to 5 meters tall. The demonic wolf had a tuft of short, grayish-white fur on its forehead. Its pure black pupils covered at least 3/4 of the space of its eyes. It was none other than the dark demonic wolf, Kota. The dark demonic wolf raised his head and opened his mouth, as though he was screaming, but nothing happened. In the next second, a figure appeared in front of him. It was another him. The dark demonic wolf's historical projection did a simple step with his 8 legs, and he instantly arrived beside the crater. After he surveyed the area, he carefully lowered his head and picked up the completely transparent curtain that had made the entire hill disappear. The curtain suddenly came alive as it rapidly contracted and spun. It wrapped around the black demonic wolf as if it was adding half a black translucent piece of clothing to him. The dark demonic wolf trembled slightly, as if it had become a clothed marionette in 2 to 3 seconds. However, this was only a historical void projection. The next breath didn't happen as the main body stopped maintaining the projection. The curtain lost its support as it instantly collapsed and lay spread out on the ground. Dark demonic wolf Kota didn't give up. He occasionally transformed the monsters around him into marionettes or summoned historical projections, allowing them to go forward again and again, experiencing all kinds of failures. However, in the end, his newest batch of marionettes still managed to pick up and control the curtain. The entire process was silent, as though it was a mime act. Following that, the gigantic demonic wolf made the marionettes bring the curtain to him. At that moment, the grayish-white fog around him churned again, forming a vortex that was comparable to a hill. The vortex emitted an invisible suction force, causing the strange curtain and dark demonic wolf Kota to be thrown towards it at the same time. Such a scene caused a substantial ripple to appear in the dreamscape. Countless points of light appeared, making it difficult for him to see the specific details. When everything returned to normal, dark demonic wolf Kota draped the transparent curtain around him and rapidly flew away from the solidified fog. And at that moment, the Moon City investigation team arrived and saw the ancient subsidiary god leave. Kota glanced at them, but he didn't stop, vanishing into the darkness. At this point, the scene shattered and the dream ended. Klein woke up. He sat up straight and tapped the edge of the long model table with his fingers as he silently muttered, "It's not that there weren't any anomalies before I arrived. More likely it is that the guards from Moon City didn't discover it. After all, the fog extends outwards to an unknown limit. What's that curtain that was spat out by the greyish-white fog? It can cover a hill when it's large, turning it into a crater, as though by magic. When it's small, it can be used as clothes by the demonic wolf, turning him into a marionette. It's a little like a high-sequence item of the seer pathway. It was spat out because I entered the world above the grey fog and completed the binding with Sapphira Castle. It seems to be able to turn the surrounding vegetation into its marionettes. This gives me a familiar feeling. Yes, there was something wrong with the food laid out in the rooms of the foggy town back then. Spirit body threads were growing out of them, reaching out towards the core of the cathedral. Once they've been eaten, one will instantly evaporate and vanish. Yes, they end up hanging in the cathedral and becoming a marionette. In other words, once one reaches the level of miracle invoker or attendant of mysteries, one can make plants or objects with spirituality grow spirit body threads, so as to turn them into marionettes. Is that curtain the beyonder characteristics of a miracle invoker or attendant of mysteries? Judging from the dark demonic wolf's performance, it might very well be the latter. This is the reason why one attendant of mysteries characteristic has been missing for a long period of time. There were only clues, but no one could find it. Before Sapphira Castle had an owner, the greyish-white fog unconsciously attracted the high-sequence characteristics of the three pathways across space and accommodated them. What is it trying to do? That suction force is really very strong. It frightened even dark demonic wolf Kota. He didn't even stop, only having thoughts of escaping. What was he suspecting? What was he afraid of? After some analysis, there was a look of excitement on his face. If he could successfully hunt down an angel like the dark demonic wolf, it would be an unparalleled harvest. Of course, the dark demonic wolf, who now had the curtain, was much harder to deal with than before. This matter had greatly reduced his confidence in succeeding. As his thoughts raced, he suddenly recalled something. From the timing of these sequence of events, the dark demonic wolf clearly had the curtain by the time he arrived in the northern city ruins. He turned the entire city into marionettes and created a marionette city. It wasn't to settle down, nor was it to accumulate helpers. It was to prepare the ritual for attendant of mysteries.